She was 24 and broke, no car, no lease, no spare key to any door. Just a canvas nursing bag and $27.43 she had counted twice beneath a bus station hand dryer. And with that amount, she bought a $1 Apothecary beside a marsh road in Church Creek, Dorchester County, Maryland, where the old settlement had fallen off county maps in 1979. Rain had opened a seam in the roof. The back wall leaned 3 inches toward the cattails. The county had condemned it since 1986 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the tincture cabinet, behind a sealed drawer of hand-planed walnut that had not been opened in over 81 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maeve Donnelly had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned departure in careful pieces. The way other children learned piano scales or multiplication tables, she learned how to fold clothes so they did not wrinkle in a trash bag. She learned which motels had ice machines that worked without a room key, which laundromats stayed warm after midnight, and how to sit still in the back seat while grown people spoke in lowered voices about rent, checks, men, weather, and what could no longer be afforded. She was born in a county hospital outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, on a cold October morning with frost on the ambulance bay windows. Her mother, Elaine, was 19 then, narrow-shouldered and watchful, with the pale, exact face of someone who had learned early that asking for help often cost more than doing without. On the birth certificate, the space for father held a name Maeve would later learn to pronounce like a town she had never visited, Patrick Donnelly. He left before she could remember his hands. There were no photographs of him on the walls, only 2 in a shoebox that stayed beneath Elaine's winter sweaters. In one, he stood beside a grain elevator with one boot hooked over the other, laughing at whoever held the camera. In the other, he wore a mechanic's shirt with his name stitched over the pocket. Maeve used to look at those pictures when she was 8 or 9 and try to decide whether absence had a face. It did not. It had a silence. It had the sound of her mother closing a drawer. Elaine worked wherever work would take her. She cleaned rooms at the Days Inn until her wrists swelled, then kept books for a plumbing contractor who paid late but paid in cash. She waited tables at a diner where the coffee burned down to tar by noon and came home smelling of fryer oil and lemon bleach. She was not cruel. Cruelty would have taken more certainty than Elaine possessed. She was tired, and her tiredness filled the rooms before she did. Still, there had been tenderness in those early years, though it came in practical forms. Elaine cut Maeve's bangs over the kitchen sink. She warmed cans of tomato soup on winter nights and poured milk into them to make them last. She saved the blue glass jars from instant coffee because Maeve liked how they caught sunlight on the sill. When Maeve had pneumonia at 6, Elaine slept sitting upright beside her for 3 nights, one hand on the child's back, counting each breath as if keeping time could keep life in place. Then when Maeve was 9, Elaine took her west for the first time to stay with her mother's aunt, Ruthie Bell Donnelly, in a weathered farmhouse outside Cumberland, Maryland. The house sat at the end of a gravel lane where Queen Anne's lace grew higher than the mailbox, and behind it the land stepped down into a wet meadow full of mint, willow, jewelweed, and nettle. Ruthie Bell was not Maeve's grandmother by blood close enough for a courthouse chart, but she was the first elder who made the child feel expected. Ruthie Bell was 72 that summer, broad-handed, silver-haired, and slow in the way of people who waste no motion. She had been a nurse's aide once, then a midwife's helper, then the woman people came to when they had coughs that would not lift, burns that needed drawing, grief that had settled into the joints. She did not call herself a healer. She said that was the Lord's word, not hers. She called herself a keeper. Every Saturday morning she took Maeve into the low shed behind the house, where bundles of dried plants hung upside down from twine strung across the rafters. Calendula, yarrow, mullein, comfrey, lavender, boneset, elderflower. Their names entered Maeve's life like relatives. Ruthie Bell made her say each one aloud before touching it, not for superstition but for attention. A thing named rightly, Ruthie said, was less likely to be used carelessly. The ritual never changed. First, they opened the shed door and stood there without speaking, letting the damp night air leave and the morning come in. Then Ruthie Bell set a chipped enamel basin on the workbench and filled it with clean water from a blue pitcher. Maeve washed her hands up to the wrists. Not quick, not like a child impatient for biscuits. Ruthie inspected her fingernails, then nodded toward the shelves. There were jars labelled in black ink, each label trimmed square and glued straight. There were corked bottles of tincture, brown and green glass, arranged by season. There were tins of salve wrapped with paper bands and tied with thread. On the far wall hung a narrow cabinet with shallow drawers, each drawer holding folded muslin, beeswax, dried peel, or little paper packets of seeds saved from plants. Ruthie trusted. Nothing was decorative. Everything waited for use. Maeve learned to bruise peppermint with the back of a spoon, never chop it to death. She learned to dry orange peel where sun could reach but flies could not. She learned that comfrey went on skin, not in the belly, and that willow bark needed patient heat, not boiling anger. Ruthie showed her how to write the date on every bottle where the plant had been gathered, whether the morning had been wet, whether the moon mattered only because people became careful when they believed it did. At noon they ate cornbread with sorghum and sliced tomatoes salted on a blue plate. In the afternoon Ruthie told stories, not grand stories, never about presidents or battles, but hand-sized stories about women who kept fever down through a night, men who walked 7 miles for cough syrup during the coal strike, children saved not by miracles but by clean cloth, warm broth, and somebody staying awake. Maeve listened with both elbows on the table, face held between her palms. Once, when Maeve was 11, she grew impatient with measuring dried elderberries into a crock. She wanted to pour by instinct, as she had seen Ruthie do, letting the dark berries fall from her palm in a black, rattling stream. Ruthie stopped her with 2 fingers on the child's wrist. "Care is not fear," she said. "Care is how love gets a body." Maeve remembered the sentence because Ruthie did not soften it afterward. She let the words sit between them among the jars and the dust. Later, Maeve would understand that Ruthie meant every careful thing was a form love could take when feelings were too wild or too private to be trusted on their own. A clean bandage, a measured spoon, a label that would not fade, a hand staying steady because another life depended on it. Those weekends became the fixed stones in Maeve's young life. Between them the rest shifted. Elaine moved them for work, for cheaper rent, for men she hoped would stay kind, for reasons she explained and then stopped explaining. Maeve learned new school hallways and forgot them. She learned how to make friends lightly, without roots, but once a month, sometimes twice, if Elaine could manage gas money, the bus or a borrowed sedan carried her back to Ruthie Bell's meadow, and the girl's breathing changed before the gravel lane even appeared. When Maeve was 17, Ruthie Bell's hands began to shake. At first it was only the teacup, then the pen, then the small brass scale she used for dried roots. She laughed at it once, a single dry sound, and told Maeve that the body was honest even when a person had more plans. By March, she could no longer climb the porch steps without pausing. By May, the shed door stayed shut unless Maeve opened it. The plants kept hanging from the rafters, but dust gathered on the jars and the labels began to curl at the corners. Ruthie died in late August, during a storm that knocked power out across the valley. The funeral was held in a brick church with a fellowship hall that smelled of coffee and wet coats. Maeve stood beside Elaine and watched people approach the casket with the solemn, helpless faces of those who had once received something and could not return it. A miner's widow brought a jar of blackberry preserves. A school secretary brought yellow roses. An old man with a cane stood for a long time without speaking, then touched the edge of the coffin as though it were a door. Afterward, there should have been the shed. There should have been the jars, the notebooks, the muslin bundles, the cabinet with shallow drawers, the brass scale, the blue pitcher, Ruthie's handwritten recipes, the hand lens she used for leaf veins, the mortar worn smooth on one side by decades of patient grinding. Maeve knew each object as if it had a pulse. But Ruthie had died without a current will anyone could find, and the farmhouse passed sideways through the family to a cousin from Ohio who had no use for an aging shed full of dry weeds. By the time Maeve found a ride back, the house had already been emptied, the shed shelves were bare, the rafters held only clipped pieces of twine. A rectangle of cleaner wood on the workbench showed where the brass scale had stood. The cousin said he had called an estate buyer. Maybe things had gone to auction. Maybe the notebooks were in a box. Maybe the jars had been thrown away because old medicines made people nervous. Maeve did not answer him. She walked behind the shed to the edge of the wet meadow where Goldenrod leaned beneath the weight of bees and stood with her hands closed so tightly that her nails marked her palms. The loss had no single shape she could fight. It had already happened. It had been handled by strangers, lifted, sorted, priced, discarded, carried off. That autumn she enrolled in community college for nursing, because nursing was care with a wage attached, and wages mattered. She was good at it in the way quiet people often are. She remembered dosages, she noticed lips going grey before machines announced trouble. She learned to speak gently without promising what she could not control. Professors praised her steadiness, her charting, her willingness to take difficult patients. At 22, she became a licensed practical nurse and went to work in a rehabilitation centre near Hagerstown. For a while, life narrowed into something almost manageable. 12-hour shifts, compression socks, peanut butter sandwiches eaten in the car, a rented room above a garage, a second-hand winter coat with one loose button. She kept a small notebook in her scrub pocket, and on the back pages, between blood pressure readings and reminder lists, she wrote what she could remember from Ruthie Bell. Mullein for cough, calendula oil 6 weeks in sun, yarrow, bitter, stops bleeding, never use what you cannot name. Then Elaine married Victor Sloane. Victor did not shout, that was part of his power. He was a soft-footed man with clean fingernails, iron shirts, and a habit of standing in doorways as if measuring whether the room had become less his by someone else being in it. He worked as a claims adjuster for an insurance company, and spoke in the careful phrases of denial letters. He never called Maeve lazy. He said she lacked planning. He never called Elaine weak. He said she needed structure. He never said Ruthie Bell's ways were foolish. He said old women often confused memory with evidence. At first, Maeve kept away from him. She visited her mother only on Sundays, bringing groceries when she could, fixing leaky faucets, sitting at the kitchen table while Victor read the paper in the next room and turned each page with deliberate neatness. The house seemed colder after he moved in, not in temperature, but in permission. Coasters appeared beneath every glass. Mail was stacked by size. Elaine's coffee mugs vanished from their hooks and returned to a cabinet where they could not be seen. Victor disliked loose ends, and to him, Maeve was one. When her rented room was sold and the new owner wanted it empty, Elaine told her she could come home for a little while. Those were the words, a little while. Maeve arrived with 2 suitcases, her nursing bag, and 1 cardboard box of books. She took the basement room where the ceiling pipes clicked at night and the window well collected leaves. She paid Elaine what she could. She bought her own food. She worked double shifts when flu season filled the rehab beds. Victor kept a yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer. On it he wrote household expenses in columns so straight they looked printed. Milk, heat, electric, waste collection. Maeve saw her name appear one morning between water and cable. Not Maeve's rent. Just Maeve, followed by a figure underlined twice. No one discussed it while Elaine stirred oatmeal at the stove. In the months that followed, Victor's order tightened by small increments. The hallway closet was rearranged and Maeve's coat moved to the basement stair hook. Her laundry detergent disappeared from the shelf because, Victor said, shared products confused accounting. The old blue glass coffee jars she had kept since childhood were wrapped in newspaper and placed in a box labelled non-essential. Her nursing bag was moved from a kitchen chair to the basement landing, then from the landing to the bottom step. The conflict, if anyone had named it, would have sounded too minor to justify the ache it caused. No doors slammed, no plates broke. Victor simply made the house inhospitable, one correction at a time. Elaine watched these adjustments with the still face of a woman who had chosen shelter and did not want to inspect the cost. The end came on November 18th, 2022. It was a Friday. Maeve remembered because the rehab center had served baked fish for lunch, and the smell had clung to her scrubs through the evening med pass. She came home at 8:40 with a paper sack of discounted apples and found her belongings stacked in the front hall, 2 suitcases, 1 cardboard box, the canvas nursing bag, her winter boots set side by side on the mat, with the laces tucked in. On top of the box sat Ruthie Bell's last object, the only one Maeve still had from the farmhouse, a cracked brown bottle with no label. Empty now, but still smelling faintly of alcohol and dried lavender when the cork was warmed in the hand. Victor stood beside the thermostat. Elaine stood by the sink with a dish towel twisted around her fingers. Maeve looked at the bottle first, then at the box, then at her mother. Victor had folded a white envelope and placed it against the suitcase handle. Inside were 2 $20 bills and a typed note stating that temporary family accommodations had concluded. He had signed his full name at the bottom. Elaine had not signed, but her silence stood there beside his signature, small and complete. Maeve did not ask why. That would have given the scene a shape it did not deserve. Victor spoke in the same voice he used for telemarketers and bank clerks. You need to make other arrangements by tonight. 8 words. Neat as a receipt. Maeve waited for Elaine to move. A hand on the table would have been enough, a step forward. Her name spoken once without apology. Instead, Elaine folded the dish towel into a square, then unfolded it again. Her eyes were red at the rims, but she kept them lowered, fixed on the sink drain as though something important might still be rescued from there. Maeve picked up the bottle and wrapped it in a t-shirt. She placed it deep in the nursing bag, between her stethoscope and the paperback drug guide with a broken spine. Then she lifted the suitcases. The left one had a bad wheel and scraped the threshold as she pulled it over. Outside, the streetlights had come on. Frost was already silvering the roofs of parked cars. Behind her, the front door closed carefully. Not slammed, not hurried, just shut with the same deliberate quiet Victor brought to every ending. For 6 weeks, Maeve lived between places that did not ask for much. The first 2 nights she slept in the staff locker room at the rehab center, sitting upright beneath the humming fluorescent light with her coat over her knees. On the 3rd morning, a supervisor found her brushing her teeth in the employee bathroom and looked away too quickly. Nothing was said, but by noon Maeve's schedule had changed. Fewer shifts, less overtime, a reminder that staff facilities were not personal lodging. She took a bus to Frederick because a former classmate had once said there was work there. There was no work, or none that came quickly enough. She slept one night in the vestibule of a Methodist church where the stone floor held the day's cold. A woman from the church office gave her coffee in a paper cup and the number of a shelter that was full before sunset. Her money became a weather system she studied closely. $40 from Victor's envelope, then $32 after the bus, $26 after a laundromat and peanut butter, $19 after ibuprofen, because her back had begun to seize from carrying both suitcases. She left one suitcase in a donation bin behind a grocery store in Frederick, keeping only what fit in the other and the canvas nursing bag. It felt less like loss than arithmetic. From Frederick, she rode to Baltimore on a commuter bus, standing in the aisle for the last 20 miles while rain ran down the windows in crooked lines. In Baltimore, she spent 2 nights at Penn Station, never sleeping deeply, always waking when footsteps approached. She learned the positions other people used to make rest look accidental: chin down, bag strap looped around wrist, shoes touching the suitcase, one hand inside a coat pocket holding whatever could not be replaced. A transit officer told her she could not remain there. His voice was not unkind. That almost made it worse. She walked to a day center near Fallsway, where the air smelled of wet wool, coffee, and old paper. A nurse there noticed the stethoscope in her bag and asked where she had worked. Maeve told her. The nurse wrote down 2 staffing agencies on the back of a referral form, but every application wanted an address, and every address wanted money before it became real. For a week she stayed in Annapolis, then less by choice than drift. A shelter bed opened for 3 nights. She washed her socks in a sink and hung them over the rail at the foot of the bunk. During the day she sat in the public library because libraries allowed quiet people to remain still without buying anything. She read local newspapers, not for news, but for warmth and the human murmur of ordinary troubles. Zoning meeting, church supper, estate sale, lost dog, farm equipment, county auction. By then her funds had diminished to $27.43. She counted it on the third floor of the Annapolis Library beneath a table near the Maryland history shelves. One wrinkled 1015, 9 ones, the rest in quarters, dimes, nickels and pennies, sorted into the shallow lid of an aspirin bottle. She had not eaten since the previous evening, but she did not spend the money yet. Once coins became food, they did not become road again. The classified ad appeared in a weekly paper from Dorchester County, folded into a wooden rack near the elevator. It was not large. Most people would have missed it between notices for crab pots and an estate sale of farm tools. Maeve saw the word apothecary first, because Ruthie Bell had once said it with affection, stretching the middle syllables as if the word itself carried drawers and bottles inside it. County property disposition, former apothecary structure, Church Creek vicinity, parcel irregular, building condemned, no utilities, transfer price, $1 plus recording fee, purchaser assumes all liability, repair, tax, and demolition obligations. Inquiries, Dorchester County Clerk, Cambridge, MD. Maeve read it once, then again, pressing one finger beneath each line as if the words might shift when released. A $1 building was not a gift, even in her condition she knew that. It was a burden the county wanted moved from one column to another. Condemned meant rot, liens, danger, weather, animals, mould, paperwork, and men with clipboards saying no. No utilities meant no heat, no water, no light, except what could be carried in. Irregular parcel meant some forgotten strip of land nobody had wanted badly enough to measure twice. Still, the word apothecary remained. It opened a door in her that had been sealed since Ruthie Bell's shed stood empty. Maeve looked around the library at the long tables, the green-shaded lamps, the patrons bent over newspapers and laptop screens. Nobody knew that a life could tilt on a classified ad printed in cheap ink. Nobody knew that a woman with damp socks and a cracked bottle in her bag had just found a sentence that seemed addressed to the part of her no one had managed to evict. She tore nothing from the paper. Ruthie Bell had taught her not to take what was meant for others. Instead, she copied the notice into her pocket notebook with the same care she once used for tincture dates. Dorchester County Clerk, Cambridge, transfer price, liability, repair, demolition. She wrote the phone number twice. At the circulation desk, she asked if there was a public computer available. The librarian, a woman with grey hair pinned in a loose coil, looked at Maeve's tired face and did not ask for a card. She wrote guest on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter. Maeve searched bus routes, Annapolis to Easton, Easton to Cambridge, Cambridge to Church Creek, maybe if the county shuttle ran, and if she had understood the schedule correctly. The total fare would leave her with enough for one cheap meal and the recording fee only if the clerk accepted cash and only if no hidden charge appeared. The arithmetic was thin enough to see through. She sat there until the computer session expired. Outside evening had settled over Annapolis with a cold rain. Cars moved along the wet street, their headlights trembling in the puddles. Maeve stood beneath the library awning and ate the last apple from the sack she had carried out of Victor's house. It had bruised along one side, the flesh brown beneath the skin. But she ate around the softness carefully and held the core in her palm until there was nothing more to take from it. The decision did not arrive like courage. It came more like exhaustion choosing a direction. She could spend the remaining money staying nowhere by degrees, buying one more sandwich, one more day of bus fare between towns that did not expect her, or she could carry the same hunger east, toward a condemned building no reasonable person wanted, because unreasonable things had been the only ones that ever kept a place open for her. Before dawn, she returned to the bus station with her suitcase, her canvas nursing bag, Ruthie Bell's bottle, and the copied notice folded inside her coat pocket. By mid-morning, the road would begin to flatten toward the eastern shore, and the land ahead would turn to black water. Pine, marsh grass, and winter fields, all of it waiting without promise. The bus left Annapolis before the coffee shops had opened their doors, carrying its few passengers east through a grey morning that looked rinsed of colour. Maeve sat 2 rows behind the driver with her suitcase wedged against her knees and the canvas nursing bag held upright between her boots. The heat came in uneven gusts from a vent beneath the window, hot enough to sting her shins and not strong enough to warm the glass. Beyond the bridge the world loosened. Brick buildings gave way to flat fields, ditches silvered with standing water, pine brakes, low barns, and long straight roads where blackbirds lifted from the shoulders in one dark sheet. She did not sleep. Sleep on public transportation had become a form of trust she could not afford. Instead, she watched the shore widen around her mile by mile, and when the bus stopped in Easton, she carried her suitcase down the steps with both hands and waited in a shelter where somebody had scratched initials into the plastic windbreak. The next bus came 40 minutes late. The driver did not apologize. The passengers did not expect him to. By Cambridge, the rain had stopped and the cold had sharpened. A bank clock near the courthouse read 38 degrees, though the wind off the chop tank made it feel lower. Maeve stood on the sidewalk and studied the route she had copied from the library computer, then folded the paper twice and put it away. The county shuttle toward Church Creek ran once in the afternoon, but not close enough to the clerk's office, and not with enough certainty for a woman whose whole plan depended on arriving while a counter was still open. So she walked. The suitcase fought her from the first block, its bad wheel caught in cracks and tilted on brick pavers. She switched hands every few minutes. The nursing bag strap cut a familiar line across her shoulder, the same place it had pressed during long shifts when her pockets held alcohol swabs, pens, and tape. By the time she reached the county building, her palms were red, and the muscles in her forearm had begun to tremble. She did not go in at once. She stood outside beneath a sycamore tree whose bark peeled in pale plates, waiting for her breathing to settle. Across the street, Cambridge moved in its ordinary morning. A bakery with a striped awning carried trays of rolls to the front case. A barber shop turned its pole slowly, though no customer yet sat inside. A marine supply store displayed rope, rain gear, crab gauges, and brass cleats in the window. Beside it, a narrow cafe advertised oyster stew on a chalkboard. Farther down, a pawn and repair shop showed guitars, watches, a row of socket wrenches, and 3 tarnished trumpets beneath fluorescent light. All of it looked established in a way that made her careful. Towns had memories before strangers arrived. They knew who had married whom, who owed money, whose father drank, whose aunt had been kind, which property held trouble in its walls. Maeve knew enough not to confuse a public sidewalk with belonging. She straightened her coat, lifted the suitcase by its handle to keep the bad wheel silent, and went inside. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a square brick building with polished stone steps worn shallow in the centre. The lobby smelled of floor wax, toner, damp wool, and the faint mineral odour of old radiators. A directory behind glass listed departments in black plastic letters: land records, probate, permits, tax assessment, vital records. The ceiling held long fluorescent tubes that hummed softly over the morning line of people waiting to pay, file, renew, certify, dispute, or understand. Maeve took a numbered slip from a red dispenser and sat on a wooden bench near a rack of pamphlets. Her number was 38. The sign above the counter showed 31. She set her suitcase upright between her knees and rested both hands on the handle. While she waited, she watched. The clerk behind window 1 wore a red cardigan and moved briskly through marriage licenses. Window 2 handled tax bills, each customer leaving with folded paper and a different expression. Window 3 remained closed, its blind pulled halfway down. At window 4, a woman in a charcoal sweater stamped documents with such controlled force that the brass head flashed each time it struck the paper. Her hair was white and cut straight at the jaw. Her glasses hung on a silver chain, and the nameplate in front of her read MRS, Evelyn Harrow, Senior Clerk. When Maeve's number appeared, Mrs. Harrow did not call it. She simply looked up, and the room seemed to understand that looking was enough. Maeve approached with the folded classified notice already in her hand. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Before being asked anything, Mrs. Harrow took the notice and set one fingertip on the county seal printed at the top. Her nails were short, unpolished, and exact. "You are here about the Church Creek parcel." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk looked at Maeve's suitcase, then at the nursing bag, then back to the notice. She did not do it rudely. She did it as a woman trained to read documents, weather, and people in the order they presented themselves. "You understand this is not a residence?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the building has no certificate of occupancy?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no county water, no current electrical service, no functioning septic record, and no guarantee of structural safety?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that if the building falls, burns, floods, injures someone, attracts trespassers, or is found in violation, the burden transfers to you?" Maeve's mouth had gone dry. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Harrow took off her glasses and laid them squarely on the counter. "You also understand that properties do not sell for $1 because someone forgot their value." The sentence was not unkind, but it was heavy. Maeve received it with both hands around the suitcase handle. "Yes, ma'am." For the first time, the older woman's expression changed. Not softened. Exactly. It settled. "Come around to the side door." A buzzer sounded. A narrow door at the end of the counter released with a tired metallic click, and Maeve stepped through into the working part of the office. It was warmer behind the counter, crowded with file carts, map drawers, computer monitors, and shelves of bound records whose spines had faded from maroon to brown. Mrs. Harrow motioned toward a chair beside her desk. The desk held 2 stacks of paper, a jar of sharpened pencils, a ceramic mug full of binder clips, and a brass stamp so old its wooden handle had darkened where hands had held it for years. On the wall behind her hung a framed plat map of the county, creased at the folds and marked in pencil along certain marsh roads. Mrs. Harrow opened a file folder and removed a deed packet clipped with a black binder. "Read every page," she said. "Do not pretend to read. Read." Maeve read. The legal language was dense, patient, and without comfort. Parcel number, metes and bounds, former commercial use, tax arrears forgiven upon transfer, demolition order stayed 120 days pending stabilization, purchaser assumes responsibility, no warranty, no representation, environmental unknowns, title conveyed as is, structure uninhabitable, use prohibited until inspected and approved. She read slowly, line by line, tracing where the words turned and closed. Mrs. Harrow worked beside her in silence, entering numbers into a system that clicked every few seconds beneath her fingernails. When Maeve reached the signature page, the clerk slid a pen toward her. "You may still decline." Maeve looked through the office window. Outside, a man in a brown coat stood beside the bakery door, speaking to someone inside with one hand raised against the cold. A gull circled over the courthouse roof and vanished beyond the cornice. The world was continuing with or without her consent. She signed. Her hand did not shake until after the first signature, and then only slightly. Mrs. Harrow turned each page, indicated each line, and Maeve wrote her name where the county required. The letters looked more formal than she felt. When the final page was signed, Mrs. Harrow gathered the packet, squared it against the desk, and drew the brass stamp toward her. The stamp came down once. The sound moved through Maeve's body. Not loud. Final. Mrs. Harrow signed as witness, dated the transfer, and entered the recording number in blue ink. Then she counted the small fee from Maeve's folded bills and coins without remarking on the pennies. She placed $1 apart from the rest, a creased bill worn soft at the middle, and slid it beneath a paperweight shaped like the state of Maryland. "For the property consideration," she said. The bill looked embarrassed there, too thin to hold a building, too ordinary to matter. Mrs. Harrow made 3 copies. One went into the county file. One went into a mailing envelope addressed to no one yet. One she placed in front of Maeve. "This is your copy. Keep it dry. Keep it with you." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk opened a drawer and removed a ring with 2 keys, one long iron skeleton key, darkened by age, and one newer brass padlock key with a paper tag tied by string. On the tag someone had written Rear Hasp, maybe in the 1970s. The ink had bled where it met a water stain. "The front lock may or may not turn, Mrs." Harrow said. "The rear door was secured by county maintenance after children got in 7 years ago. If the padlock has rusted past use, do not force the jamb. The jamb is older than both of us." She took the plat map down from the wall and laid it across the desk. "You leave Cambridge south on Route 16, then toward Church Creek. You will pass the firehouse, the old feed building, and a white house with a green metal roof. After that, the road narrows. There is a marsh pull-off where birdwatchers park in spring. Do not turn there. Keep walking until you see 2 black walnut trees on the right and a collapsed rail fence. The apothecary sits back from the ditch. The sign is still hanging, unless last week's wind finally took it." Maeve repeated the directions under her breath. Mrs. Harrow watched her. "Do you have a ride?" "No." "Ma'am, that is 7 miles from here. I can walk. It will be dark before 5. "I know." The clerk's eyes moved again to the nursing bag. "You were medical." "Yes." "Ma'am, rehab nursing." "Were." Maeve did not explain the difference between losing a job and losing the address that made keeping one possible. She held the deed copy in both hands and said nothing. "Mrs." Harrow turned back to the file as if the matter were finished. Then, before closing it, she paused. "What did you say your name was?" Maeve looked at her. "Maeve Donnelly." The older woman did not move for several seconds. A phone rang somewhere behind probate. A printer started and stopped. The office continued around them while Mrs. Harrow's hand remained on the open file. "Donnelly," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Any relation to Ruth Bell Donnelly from Allegheny County?" The name crossed the desk and entered the room with such plain force that Maeve had to grip the edge of the chair. "She was my great-aunt," Maeve said, then corrected herself because Ruthie Bell had always deserved better than imprecision. "My mother's aunt. She raised parts of me." Mrs. Harrow sat back slowly. "I knew her by correspondence," she said. "Not well?" "Enough." Maeve could not speak. The clerk opened the middle drawer of her desk and searched beneath a stack of receipt books. From the bottom she took a narrow envelope, yellowed but not fragile, and turned it over once as if confirming that time had not altered the handwriting. There was no stamp, only a note on the front in blue ink. "Church Creek Apothecary Inquiry, 1994, R.B. Donnelly." "She wrote our office 3 times, Mrs. Harrow said. Asked whether the property still stood, asked who held title, asked if any interior fixtures remained. At the time, the county had not yet taken possession. There were liens and no clear owner. Nothing could be done." Maeve looked at the envelope but did not reach for it. "She knew about it. She knew of it." "I cannot say more than that, Mrs." Harrow tapped the envelope lightly against the desk. She asked whether an apothecary cabinet was still inside. The office seemed to draw back around the 2 women, leaving only the desk, the map, the keys, the copy of the deed, and the thin yellow envelope. "Why, Mrs." Harrow's face held the careful reserve of someone who had worked too long among records to offer meaning where paper gave only facts. She did not say. She placed the envelope on top of Maeve's deed copy. "This belongs with the file. Strictly speaking, "But the file is yours now." Maeve's fingers closed over the paper. Ruthie Bell's handwriting stood on the front, slanted and dark, unmistakable even after all these years. It was not a message, it was not an answer. It was only proof that a woman Maeve had loved had once turned her attention toward this same forgotten building and asked after the same hidden room. Mrs. Harrow stood, signalling that the meeting had ended. At the side door, she handed Maeve the keys and a folded county map. "Mind the floorboards near the rear workroom," she said. "The maintenance man put his boot through one in 2016. "Yes, ma'am." "And Miss Donnelly." Maeve turned. The clerk's voice lost a fraction of its official edge. "If you find something that is not yours, read before you spend." Maeve nodded, though she did not understand. Outside, the day had moved toward afternoon. The sky had lowered into a flat pewter colour, and the wind carried the smell of tidal water even this far from the open marsh. Maeve put the deed copy, the envelope and the map into the inner pocket of her coat, beneath the folded classified notice. The keys went into her left hand. She kept them there while she walked, feeling the iron one press a dark crescent into her palm. Route 16 took her out of Cambridge slowly. Traffic passed in gusts. Pickup trucks, a school bus, a county van, a sedan with one headlight dim. She stayed on the shoulder where there was one and stepped into grass when there was not. The suitcase wheel complained over gravel, then gave up entirely 3 miles out, locking at an angle so she had to half drag, half carry the thing along the road. Her shoulder burned beneath the nursing bag. Hunger moved from her stomach into her back and became a steady hollow ache. She passed a cemetery with plastic flowers bright against winter grass. She passed a church sign offering Wednesday supper and Sunday forgiveness. She passed a closed produce stand, its bins empty, its hand-lettered prices still nailed to the wall: tomatoes, okra, sweet corn, melons. A brown dog came out from behind a mailbox and trotted beside her for 20 yards, tail low, curious but not brave. When Maeve stopped, the dog stopped when she said, "Go home." It looked at her with yellow eyes, then turned and slipped through a gap in a hedge. The road narrowed after the firehouse. The old feed building stood exactly where Mrs. Harrow had said it would, its tin roof rusted through in 2 places, its loading dock sagging toward a gravel lot beyond it. A white house with a green metal roof watched the road from behind a line of winter bare hydrangeas. Smoke rose cleanly from its chimney. A man splitting wood in the side yard paused with the maul resting against one boot and watched Maeve pass. He lifted 2 fingers from the handle. She lifted 2 back. Walnut trees appeared before the building did. They stood on the right side of the road, black and broad-limbed, with bark deeply furrowed and a scatter of husks darkening the grass beneath them. Behind them lay the collapsed rail fence, silver with age, 2 rails down, one rail still suspended between posts that leaned like tired shoulders. A ditch ran parallel to the road, full of brown water and cattails, and beyond the ditch the land rose only slightly before sinking toward marsh. Maeve stopped. At first she saw only brush, bayberry, honeysuckle, sumac, pokeweed stems gone hollow and pale. Then, behind the tangle, the roof line appeared. The apothecary was smaller than she had imagined and more stubborn. Its front wall faced the road at an angle, as though the road had shifted over time and the building had declined to turn with it. The structure measured perhaps 22 feet wide and 34 feet deep, 1.5 stories under a steep cedar shingle roof patched in places with black tar paper that had curled at the edges. The lower walls were brick, handmade and irregular, their mortar pale and worn. Above them, weatherboard siding ran in narrow horizontal courses, grey from salt air and neglect. A single chimney rose from the left side, built of soft red brick darkened near the crown. The cap had cracked. A rusted stovepipe collar showed where something had once vented through the back room. 4 front windows looked toward the road. 2 were boarded. One held broken glass in 3 jagged teeth. The last had gone cloudy, but remained whole, reflecting the low winter sky. The sign still hung. It swung from a wrought iron bracket above the front door, moving slightly though the wind had quieted. The paint had almost gone, but the carved letters remained beneath the weathering. Shallow and patient. Bell Donnelly, Apothecary, herbs, tinctures, salves. Maeve read the name once, then she read it again. Because the first reading had entered too quickly for sense. Bell Donnelly, not Ruthie Bell, not exactly, not proof enough for a court, but close enough to make the afternoon alter its weight, close enough to make the keys in her palm feel less like property and more like something handed through a narrow opening between years. She crossed the ditch by way of 2 flat stones and pushed through the brush to the front step. The step was granite, cracked at one corner, sunk slightly into the earth. Burdock burrs caught her coat. The suitcase snagged in honeysuckle, and she left it there for the moment, standing alone before the door. The front lock accepted the iron key but resisted turning. Maeve worked it gently. She remembered Mrs. Harrow's warning about forcing old wood, so she did not twist hard. She took off her glove, breathed warm air onto the key, eased it back a fraction, then forward again. Something inside the lock shifted with a dry internal scrape. The bolt moved. The door opened inward less than a foot before catching on debris. Cold air came out first, stale and mineral, carrying with it the smell of dust, mouse nests, old paper, damp brick and herbs, so faint they seemed less present than remembered. Maeve set one shoulder to the door and pushed carefully. Something scraped across the floor, a fallen strip of plaster, a bird's nest, a drift of leaves ground down to brown lace. She entered sideways. The front room had once been the shop. She knew it before naming it. A counter ran along the right wall, its glass display case cracked but still in place, clouded with dust from the inside. Behind it stood shelves from floor to ceiling, many empty, some holding brown bottles filmed in grey, a few with corks still seated and labels faded to ghosts. On the left wall, a built-in bench sat beneath the windows. Above it, narrow cubbies held string, folded paper and one rusted pair of scissors fused half open. The floor was wide plank, uneven but mostly intact near the front. White pine perhaps, darkened by age and water stains. The ceiling sloped slightly toward the back. A calendar from 1958 hung by one nail beside the counter, its picture showing a field of red clover and a Holstein cow looking politely toward the viewer. December. No one had turned the page after that. Maeve stood in the centre of the room and listened. The building made sounds even in stillness. A tick from the cooling roof, a soft tap where a loose sign chain moved outside. Water somewhere, not dripping fast, but gathering and letting go at patient intervals. Beneath those sounds lay the heavier silence of a place that had not been asked to explain itself in a very long time. She set the nursing bag on the counter and lifted it down again when dust rose in a thin, disturbed cloud. The taste of it reached her tongue, dry and bitter. She covered her mouth with her sleeve until the air settled. Behind the front room, an open doorway led to the workroom. The floor changed there. The boards were narrower, more worn, and in 2 places repaired with rougher lumber. A large cast-iron stove stood against the chimney wall, its door ajar. Ash hardened inside like grey clay. Beside it, a brick hearth extended in a shallow rectangle. Along the back wall ran the tincture cabinet. Maeve stopped at the threshold. It was built of walnut, darker than anything else in the room, reaching from waist height nearly to the ceiling. Dozens of small drawers occupied the upper half, each with a brass pull and a paper label behind a clouded mica window. Tansy, valerian, angelica, gentian, licorice, echinacea, clove, myrrh. Beneath the drawers were 2 panelled doors and a broad work surface scarred by knife marks, burn rings and the circular impressions of jars that had stood there for years. A narrow shelf above held 5 blue glass bottles, empty but unbroken. She did not touch the cabinet. Not yet. The back door was secured by the newer padlock. The brass key turned with effort, scraping through rust, and the hasp opened into her hand. Outside lay a small yard gone wild, then marsh grass and a thread of black water reflecting the last light. An outhouse leaned near a sweet gum tree. A hand pump stood beside a stone well curb, its handle tied upright with wire. Beyond that, cattails moved in a slow wind that did not seem to reach the road. Maeve brought the suitcase inside before dark finished gathering. The first practical work was not restoration, it was survival. She cleared a patch of floor near the front room bench by lifting plaster, twigs, mouse-chewed paper, and 2 broken shingles into a corner. She tested each board with her boot before trusting it. Near the rear workroom, 1 plank gave softly beneath her weight, and she marked it with a strip of torn paper from the county envelope, weighted by a piece of brick. There was no electricity. When evening closed, it did so completely. Maeve used the last strength of her phone battery to find the small flashlight at the bottom of the nursing bag, then turned the phone off. The flashlight beam moved over shelves, bottles, a cobwebbed ceiling, the cracked display case, the brass drawer pulls of the cabinet in the other room. Each object appeared, then vanished as the light passed. Her meal was half a sleeve of crackers left from the day center in Baltimore, and water from a bottle she had refilled at the county building. She ate slowly, sitting on the floor with her back against the bench, coat still on, boots unlaced but not removed. The cold came up through the planks and entered her bones with deliberate patience. She wrapped her scarf around her ears. Her breath showed faintly when the flashlight crossed it. Outside, something moved in the brush. Raccoon. Maybe a possum. Wind in dry stems. The sign creaked once, then settled. Farther away, a truck passed on the road, its tires hissing over damp pavement. Then the sound thinned and disappeared. Maeve took Ruthie Bell's cracked bottle from the nursing bag and set it on the floor beside her deed copy. Then she placed the keys beside the bottle, then the yellowed envelope from the clerk's drawer. She did not open it. Not by flashlight, not with her hands stiff from cold, not while the building still seemed to be deciding whether to accept the sound of her breathing. She lay down with her coat beneath her shoulder and the nursing bag for a pillow. The suitcase stood against the bench like a poor little wall. Above her, the ceiling held shadows she could not read. The air smelled of dust, walnut, gold brick, old herbs, and tidal water creeping under the door. For a long while, she stayed awake. She listened to the marsh, to the boards, to the small enclosed room behind her where the tincture cabinet waited with its rows of narrow drawers. She did not feel safe, not exactly. Safety was too large a word for a condemned building with no heat and a soft place in the floor. But the place was not asking her to leave. That was something. It was a beginning as plain and severe as a signature stamped into paper. Near midnight, rain returned, tapping first on the broken window board, then spreading across the roof in uneven threads. Somewhere above the back room, water found an old path and began to drip into a pan or bucket left by someone years before. The sound repeated through the dark, measured, patient, kept. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the cold had hardened everything it touched. Maeve woke before light with her right arm numb beneath her and her boots still on. For a few seconds she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her held a pale seam where damp plaster had cracked and curled. The room smelled of wet ash, walnut, dust, and the sour little trace of mice. Then the sign outside shifted on its bracket, iron against iron, and the place returned to her all at once. She sat up carefully. Her breath showed in the air. The first 3 days did not belong to hope. They belonged to water, boards, gold hands, and the ordinary humiliations of a body that needed more than courage to keep going. She began with the well. The pump beside the stone curb looked older than most things she had trusted. A cast-iron column flecked with rust, its handle wired upright to keep the wind from moving it. The ground around it had frozen in ridges where last night's rain had gathered and stiffened. Maeve untwisted the wire with her fingers inside her sleeves, then eased the handle downward. It resisted, groaned, and rose back with nothing. She primed it with half her bottle of water. The first strokes gave only air. The next gave a cough from somewhere below the earth, hollow and complaining. She worked the handle until pain ran from her palm to her elbow. On the 17th stroke, brown water spat from the spout and splashed over her boot. On the 20th, the flow cleared to a cold iron stream that struck the stone basin with a sound so clean it nearly made her laugh. She did not drink it at once. Nursing had left her with certain cautions deeper than thirst. She filled a dented kettle found in the back room, set it aside, and planned to boil everything. Later, when the chimney could be trusted. Later, when she had fire. The outhouse stood 40 feet behind the building, leaning but upright, its door hanging from one strap hinge. Inside, cold entered through every crack. There was a wasp nest in the upper corner, empty for winter, and a Sears catalogue from 1966 warped by damp beneath a broken shelf. Maeve cleaned the seat with alcohol wipes from her nursing bag and a strip torn from an old undershirt. She did the work without complaint, because complaint would have wasted warmth. By mid-morning, she had mapped the floor's language. The front room boards near the bench gave only a dry flex. The space before the display counter held firm, though 2 nails had risen enough to catch a sock. 3 feet beyond the doorway into the workroom, the first bad plank bowed under weight with a slow, fibrous sigh. Near the stove, the floor was sounder, darkened by soot, but supported by something sturdy beneath. Along the back wall, in front of the tincture cabinet, the boards felt dense and fixed, as if the cabinet itself had anchored that side of the room for generations. She marked danger with what she had: torn paper, shards of brick, a rusted tin lid, and 1 strip of red thread from the hem of her scarf. For 3 days she learned where to step and where not to. She learned that the third board inside the front door creaked high, almost like a bird. She learned that the rear threshold held water after rain and needed to be swept with a bundle of dry grass. She learned that the left-panelled door beneath the tincture cabinet stuck because the floor had lifted, not because the hinge had failed. She learned that the roof did not leak everywhere, only in 4 honest places, which was better and worse than she had expected. The first night had been cold. The second was colder. The temperature dropped to 27 degrees, according to a radio in the gas station where she walked to refill her bottle and buy 1 packet of instant oatmeal with loose change. She ate the oatmeal dry from the paper sleeve while walking back, because she had not yet made fire and because hunger had become practical on the road. The same brown dog watched her from a driveway and did not follow. Smoke rose from the green-roofed house. A school bus passed, full of faces turned inward toward warmth and noise. On the 3rd afternoon, after boiling water remained impossible, and her fingers had cracked at 2 knuckles, Maeve took her county map, locked the rear door, and walked back toward the main road to find the hardware store Mrs. Harrow had marked in pencil. It stood 2 miles from the Apothecary, not in town proper, but at a road crossing where a former feed store, a bait cooler, and a post office box shelter made a sort of village by agreement. The sign above the door read Toll's Hardware, and Supply in blue letters faded almost white. A bell hung from a spring over the entrance. When Maeve opened the door, it struck once and then trembled into silence. Warmth met her first, then the smell: sawdust, kerosene, machine oil, burlap, seed packets, rubber boots, coffee left too long on a burner. The store was narrow and deep, with wooden floors worn smooth between the aisles. Galvanized buckets hung from the ceiling. Mason jars of loose screws and brass fittings lined a counter near the register. Stovepipe sections stood stacked in one corner like black metal drums. There were coils of rope, boxes of nails, pruning shears, lamp wicks, mouse traps, work gloves, and a shelf of old books no one had dusted in months. The man behind the counter was reading a parts catalogue through half-moon glasses. He had a narrow face, a white moustache, stained faintly yellow at the centre, and hands that looked permanently lined with soil and graphite. His plaid shirt had been washed to softness. The name stitched above the pocket read Harlan, though the receipt pad beside him said owner Harlan Tull. He looked at Maeve's coat, at her cracked knuckles, at the nursing bag, and then at the iron key hanging from a string around her neck, because she had not trusted her pockets. "You bought the Bell place," he said. Maeve took one step farther in. "Yes, sir." Harrow said somebody would either come by or freeze. Maeve could not tell if the words were warning or welcome. "I need to make the chimney safe enough for a small fire," she said. "Not a large one. Just enough to boil water and keep from freezing beside the stove." Harlan closed the parts catalogue without marking his page. "You know chimneys?" "No, sir." "You know roofs?" "No, sir." "You know when to stop before a thing kills you?" Maeve considered the question. "I am learning." He looked at her for a long second, then came out from behind the counter with a limp he did not accommodate so much as carry. He led her to the back aisle and began pulling items down. "First," he said, "you do not light anything until you know the flue is open and the firebox is not cracked clean through. You understand draft? In people. Yes. Not in buildings." He gave a small grunt that might have been the beginning of amusement but never became it. "Same principle. Almost. Air has to come in. Smoke has to go out. If smoke cannot leave, you leave?" "Yes, sir." He set a wire chimney brush on the counter, then rods in 4-foot lengths, then a cheap canvas drop cloth, a pair of leather gloves stiff as bark, a dust mask, a flashlight with batteries, a putty knife, a small whisk broom, a galvanized ash bucket, and a booklet with a green cover. The booklet was titled Home Maintenance for Owner-Occupants, revised 1974. Its pages had yellowed, and a price sticker on the corner said 35 cents. "This is not enough knowledge," he said, tapping the booklet. "But it is better than pride." Maeve looked at the growing pile and then at the money folded in her pocket. After the county fee, bus fares, and oatmeal, she had less than $12. The brush alone would take more than that. "I cannot buy all of this today. I did not ask if you could." He took a lined index card from beneath the register and wrote her name without asking how to spell it. Maeve Donnelly, Bell Place. Then he drew 4 columns. Date, item, amount, paid. "I keep accounts for watermen, widows, men who forget their wallets, and one preacher who always remembers except when he comes in for roof tar. I can keep one for you. I do not know when I can pay." "I did not ask that either." She stood very still. Harlan's face did not change, but his voice lowered a little. "My grandmother bought cough syrup there when she was carrying my father. Said the woman who ran it never let a child leave with a fever and no broth. That is not a business model. It is a debt moving around." Maeve looked down at the counter because the kindness in the room had become difficult to receive directly. "I will pay you back. I wrote your name down. Did I not?" He rang the items through anyway, speaking each price as if giving instructions. Used chimney brush, $3. Rods, 4 at 75 cents, $3. Gloves, $1 because one thumb is patched. Mask, 50 cents. Flashlight, $2. Batteries included because I do not feel like pricing batteries. Drop cloth, $1. Ash bucket, $2. Putty knife, 75 cents. Whisk broom, 50. Manual, free, since nobody alive has bought it since 1981. The total on the card came to $14.75. He wrote it in a column and did not ask for payment. Then he added a box of wooden matches and a can of condensed vegetable soup. Maeve opened her mouth. "No," Harlan said, without looking up. "Those are not hardware. They do not go on the account." She carried the supplies back with the rods tied to her suitcase handle and the ash bucket banging against her leg every few steps. The road home felt longer but not emptier. At the apothecary she set everything in the front room and sat on the bench for several minutes with her hands in her lap. The building made its usual small sounds around her: tick, creak, drip, wood settling over cold air. Then she read the chimney chapter 3 times. The manual advised inspection first, cleaning second, fire last. It spoke in a plain old voice that trusted readers to possess tools, neighbours, and sense. Maeve had one of the 3 and was borrowing toward the other 2. She began with the stove, The cast-iron door lifted slightly on its hinge and complained. Inside, the ash had hardened into layered grey plates. She broke them loose with the putty knife, scooped them into the bucket, and found beneath them a grate still sound enough to hold wood. The firebox had surface rust, but no split she could see. She ran her fingers along the seams, feeling for cracks, then used the flashlight to inspect the backplate. Soot covered everything in a dull black skin. The stovepipe rose 3 feet before entering the chimney through a thimble in the brick wall. Its seams were crusted with old creosote, glossy and black where the flashlight struck. She wrapped her scarf over her hair, tied the dust mask, spread the canvas drop cloth, and detached the lower pipe section by loosening 2 rusted screws with the flat edge of the putty knife. Because she did not own a proper screwdriver, the pipe came free with a soft collapse of soot. She coughed until her eyes watered. For 6 hours she worked in intervals measured by cold, breath, and caution. Brush up, twist clockwise, draw down, tap rods clean, add a rod, brush up again. Soot fell in dry clumps, then flakes, then fine powder that darkened the drop cloth and settled into the creases of her gloves. Creosote clung to the inside of the pipe in hard ridges, and she scraped what she could reach with the putty knife, careful not to gouge metal thinned by age. The chimney itself took longer. From the stove opening she fed the brush upward until resistance stopped it, then twisted, pressed, withdrew, and began again. Once near the second rod, the brush jammed against something solid. Her heart moved hard in her throat. She eased it down, rotated a quarter turn, pushed again, and felt the obstruction shift. A bird's nest came down in pieces, straw, twigs, feathers, a strip of blue plastic twine, 2 acorn caps, and a dry wing bone as delicate as a question. She carried the nest outside and placed it beneath the walnut trees, not because the bird needed it now, but because throwing it into the ash bucket felt wrong. By late afternoon, soot had found every exposed place on her. It darkened the lines around her fingernails, streaked one cheek, and turned the knees of her jeans nearly black. The workroom looked worse before it looked better. She swept, then swept again. She wiped the stove collar with damp rags. She reattached the pipe and sealed a small gap with furnace cement. Harlan had included without listing on the account, its lid already half used. She waited an hour, because the manual said to wait. Then she built the first fire small enough to insult winter. 3 twists of newspaper from the old 1958 calendar, 2 handfuls of dry twigs gathered beneath the eaves, and 3 narrow splits from a fallen branch she had broken over the granite step. She struck a match and held it longer than necessary, watching the flame take the paper take the twigs darken, smoke, resist, then surrender. Smoke entered the room first. Maeve opened the front door, heart quick, ready to smother the fire. But after a few thin wandering threads, the smoke pulled backward, found the pipe, and lifted. The stove made a low metal tick as heat entered it for the first time in years. She knelt on the floor and stayed there, lone hand held near but not on the iron. The warmth was modest, uncertain, local. It did not fill the room. It did not repair the roof or make the building safe. But it existed. That was enough. She boiled well water for 10 full minutes in the dented kettle, then made condensed soup in a saucepan with a chipped enamel handle. The soup tasted of salt, metal, and mercy. She ate it sitting on the floor beside the stove, using a spoon from her nursing bag, her coat open for the first time since arriving. When she finished, she held the empty saucepan in both hands to feel its remaining warmth. That night, she slept 4 hours without waking. The next morning the building had changed by 1 degree. Not warmer, not truly, but inhabited. The front room still held its dust. The roof still leaked. The soft plank remained soft. Yet the stove's small black presence had become a centre, and the kettle on top of it gave off a thread of steam that clouded the lower window pane. Maeve began inventory after breakfast, because inventory was something Ruthie Bell had believed in. Before moving, list. Before naming something lost, search carefully. She tore blank margins from the county maps out a fold and made columns with a pencil stub found in the counter drawer. Front room. Glass display case, cracked. Right front corner missing. Countersound except water damage at east end. Shelves, 14 long, 3 warped. Bottles, 63 brown, 18 green, 5 blue, 11 clear, assorted sizes. Corks intact in 22. Labels readable on 19. Scale missing. String cutter rusted but attached. Paper roll holder empty. Calendar, December 1958. Receipt spike with papers fused by damp. 1 stool, 3 legs sound, 4th repaired. She moved slowly, touching only what needed touching. The old bottles went into groups by colour, then by whether the cork remained. Labels she could still read. She copied, paregoric, empty, camphor spirits, residue, rosewater, witch hazel, tincture of benzoin, elderflower syrup, compound licorice powder. Most were commercial preparations, not Ruthie Bell's careful work, but each one had lived in the shop, had waited in the same filtered light. Back room. Cast iron stove. Kettle. Saucepan. Brick hearth. Work table with vice attached. 2 stools. Drying rack above beam. 6 hooks remaining. Mortar and pestle. Stone. Chipped rim. Funnels. Tin. 3. Muslin scraps in lower drawer. Mouse damaged. Cork press. Small. Beeswax fragments in paper. Blue bottles. 5. Tincture cabinet. She saved the cabinet for last. Not because it frightened her, because she knew in the plainest part of herself that once she began with it, the room would not be the same. The cabinet held the only order in the building that had not fully yielded to ruin. Dust lay over it, yes. 1 lower hinge had turned green. A cobweb connected the top moulding to the ceiling, but the walnut had kept its depth. Even dry and filmed, it seemed to hold light below the surface. She wiped the work surface with a damp rag, turning the cloth black. Knife marks appeared, burn rings, stains where liquids had seeped and darkened the grain, initials carved faintly near the right edge, LBED, and 1 mark too worn to read. A ruler had been incised along the front lip, inches divided by small cuts made with a steady blade. She opened the first drawer. Chamomile. Empty, except for dust and 2 curled petals pale as fingernails. Second drawer. Hyssop. A folded paper packet inside, brittle, containing only powder. Third. Bloodroot. Empty, but stained orange along 1 corner. She worked row by row, writing each label. Some drawers stuck. Some opened with a whisper. A few released old scents when moved, faint but distinct. Clove, licorice, mirror, dried lemon peel, something bitter and root dark that tugged at memory without naming itself. Near the middle of the 4th row, the pattern changed. It was the drawer labelled Valerian. Same brass pull, same mica label window, same size as the others. But when Maeve tugged it, the weight felt wrong. Not stuck. Heavy. A drawer with dried roots should not weigh like a box of stones. She held it halfway open and listened. Something inside did not shift the way loose root would shift. She carried the drawer to the work table and set it down. The bottom was lined with brown paper glued flat. She lifted 1 corner with the putty knife. Beneath the paper lay wood, ordinary and unremarkable. She pressed the bottom with her thumb. Solid. Then she tapped it. The sound was dull at the front, hollow at the back. Maeve went still. She tapped again. Front. Middle. Back. Dull. Dull. Hollow. Not large. Not open, but different enough that Ruthie Bell's voice seemed to enter the room through muscle memory. A thing named rightly was less likely to be used carelessly. She emptied the drawer completely. No valerian remained, only a few brown threads caught in the corners. Turning it over, she studied the underside. The drawer had been built of thin walnut sides dovetailed at the front. The bottom board seemed ordinary, but at the rear, where shadow gathered beneath the lip, A small circle of cedar had been set flush into the wood, no larger than a nickel. A plug. Maeve touched it with one finger. Cedar, not walnut. Slightly softer, slightly warmer in colour. Nearly invisible unless someone had cause to look. She took the putty knife and stopped herself. Not that tool. Too wide. Too rough. In the lower cabinet beneath mouse-damaged muslin, she had found a bent hairpin and 3 upholstery tacks. She fetched the hairpin, straightened it against the work table, and worked one end into the fine seam around the cedar disc. The first attempt slipped. The second raised a splinter she pressed back with her thumb. On the third the disc shifted. It came loose with a dry little click. Inside the hole was a brass screw head. Set deep. Maeve sat back. The building was silent except for the kettle ticking on the stove. She did not own a screwdriver. Then she remembered the display counter, the rusted scissors, the fused half-open blades. The narrow blade fit badly but well enough. She turned the screw a quarter turn at a time. It resisted, then moved, each rotation releasing a faint scent of cedar and dust. When the screw came free, the rear third of the drawer bottom lifted on a hidden tongue. Beneath it lay a narrow compartment. Inside was a folded piece of oilcloth. Maeve did not touch it immediately. She looked at the drawer, at the hidden bottom, at the cedar plug, at the careful screw set where no careless hand would find it. Whoever had made this hiding place had done so not in panic but in design. Not a child's secret. A keeper's secret. She lifted the oilcloth and carried it to the work surface. The first package was tied with linen thread, the knot still firm. She loosened it with the hairpin rather than cut it. Inside lay 3 tools wrapped separately in soft cloth, a small brass scale with 2 pans nested against one another, a narrow-bladed herb knife with a bone handle darkened by hand oil, and a pair of tweezers so fine they looked surgical. The scale was tarnished but intact. On the underside of its beam, in letters almost too small to read, someone had scratched B&D. Bell and Donnelly. Maeve set the tools down in a row. The second package held raw material, 6 small cakes of beeswax wrapped in waxed paper, their coloured deep gold, a packet of dried lavender still faintly fragrant after all its years, 2 cork stoppers, and a twist of linen containing seeds, black and triangular, labelled in a hand older than Ruthie Bell's. Black cumin, save from Westbed. 1938. The third package was a tin box. It had once held throat lozenges, according to the embossed lid, but the printed paper label had worn away, except for one red border. A strip of cloth had been wound around it twice and tied flat. Maeve untied the cloth, lifted the lid, and found money. Not bills, coins. At first her mind refused to sort them. They lay in the tin with a weight and colour unlike any change she had counted in library corners or bus station bathrooms. Gold coins, some small, some larger, each in a folded paper sleeve marked in ink. Silver coins wrapped separately. A few copper pieces darkened nearly brown. Beneath them, in the bottom of the tin, rested a military medal on a faded ribbon. She did not take them out quickly. She removed each coin in order and copied the notation from its paper. $5 Liberty Head Gold Half Eagle, 1881. 2050 cent Indian Head Quarter Eagle, 1911. $10 Indian Head Eagle, 1914. $20 St. Gordon's Double Eagle, 1924. Morgan Silver Dollar, 1896. Morgan Silver Dollar, 1901. Peace Dollar, 1923. Barber Half Dollar, 1908. Mercury Dimes. 12. Mixed Dates. Indian Head Cents, 7. There were 27 gold coins in all, 41 silver coins, and a paper roll of worn dimes that had gone green at one end. The paper sleeves did not state modern value. They stated face value, dates, and in some cases names, for Roof. For fever year. Not to be spent unless trade dies. Saved by LB, saved by ED, after influenza, after war. When Maeve finished counting the face values, the total came to $493.87. It was an odd, almost homely number, less than rent in most places, less than the price of a used car, but the coins themselves, she knew, might be worth far more than their stamped amounts. She had seen enough estate appraisals in patients' rooms, enough family arguments at bedside, to understand that old metal carried a second life in the eyes of collectors. The military medal lay last. It was a Purple Heart. The bronze heart dulled but recognizable. George Washington's profile worn soft under the enamel. The ribbon had faded from purple to bruised violet near the fold. On the reverse, engraved in a small formal hand, was a name. Thomas Edwin Bell, 1918. Maeve held it only by the edges. The room seemed colder around that little piece of metal, not because of death alone. Death had been present from the beginning, in the empty drawers and the calendar stopped decades ago. But this was named. This had crossed an ocean or a desk or a grieving hand and come to rest inside a drawer labelled for a root used to bring sleep. Beneath the medal lay one more thing. A letter. Sealed in an envelope made from heavy cream paper, folded once and tied with blue thread. On the front was written, "To the one who opens this when the house has no keeper." Maeve did not open it. She sat at the work table until the light changed in the windows and the front room dimmed. The coins lay sorted before her in careful rows. The tools rested on their cloth. The seeds, wax, lavender, corks, and metal had all been placed where they could be seen without touching. The opened drawer sat beside them, its hidden bottom exposed. She knew hunger. She knew cold. She knew what money could do when there was none. It could buy soup, boots, a room, a bus ticket, medicine, a phone charger, a week of not being watched suspiciously in public places. The coins seemed to know it too. They held light from the stove in their rims and gave it back without warmth, but the envelope stopped her. Not by command. By sequence. "Read before you spend, Mrs." Harrow had said. Maeve rose stiffly and covered the coins with the oilcloth. Then she placed Ruthie Bell's cracked bottle on top of the cloth, not as a lock, only as a reminder that some things survived by not being rushed. She tucked the sealed letter into the inner pocket of her coat, where the deed had been, and buttoned it there. Outside, evening had cleared. She took the flashlight and walked out the back door without turning it on. The marsh lay open beneath a sky washed pale at the horizon and darkening overhead. Water moved somewhere beyond the cattails, slow and hidden. The cold had a clean edge after the dust of the workroom. Maeve crossed to the well and stood beside the pump, looking toward the thread of black water beyond the yard. A heron lifted from the marsh without sound, its wings broad and deliberate in the fading light. It rose only high enough to clear the reeds, then settled farther off where the creek widened. Maeve watched until she could no longer separate its body from the evening. She stayed outside until her hands hurt. Inside, the cabinet waited open. The coins waited beneath oilcloth. The unopened letter rested against her ribs, receiving the warmth of her body through cotton and wool. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning entered the apothecary without warmth, a pale kind of light that spread slowly across the front room and found every place where the night had left its breath. Maeve woke with the letter still inside her coat. For a moment, she did not move. The floor beneath her had stiffened her hip. The stove had gone out some time before dawn, and the kettle on top of it held a skin of ice around the rim where steam had cooled and settled. Outside, a crow called once from the walnut trees. Then silence returned, not empty, only attentive. She sat up and took the envelope from her inner pocket. In daylight the paper looked older than it had by firelight, cream-coloured once, now darkened at the folds with two small stains near the lower edge, and a faint scent of smoke, cedar and dried lavender clinging to it. The blue thread had been tied in a square knot, not decorative, not hurried. The handwriting on the front was firm, slanted to the right, and shaped by a person who had been taught penmanship as discipline, not ornament. To the one who opens this when the house has no keeper. Maeve set the envelope on the work table and placed both palms flat beside it. She had seen handwriting like that before, though not exactly. Ruthie Bell's script had leaned the same way, with the same long upper loops and the same severe little crosses on the T's, but this hand was older, more formal. It carried a generation that had written letters before telephones became ordinary, before speed became a virtue people mistook for proof of importance. On the lower left corner, where the envelope flap had been sealed, someone had pressed a thumb lightly into the paper while the glue was still damp. The print had survived as a soft oval shadow. Maeve untied the thread. She did not tear the envelope. She worked the flap open with the hairpin, patient at each place where age had fixed paper to paper. The sound it made was small and dry, like leaves underfoot. Inside was a folded letter, 4 pages, written on the same heavy paper. A pressed sprig of something lay between the first and second pages, flattened almost to lace. Lavender, perhaps, though the colour had faded to grey. Maeve opened the letter. The first words stood clear. My dear one, whoever you are, if this paper has come into your hands, then either the house has kept its secret longer than I had any right to ask, or our line has become so thin that names no longer know where to find one another. I'm writing in the back room of Bell and Donnelly Apothecary on the 17th day of October 1941. With rain against the east window and the marsh high enough to shine through the cattails. My name is Eleanor Donnelly Bell. I am 61 years old. 3 weeks ago in Baltimore, Dr. Harold Whitcomb of Johns Hopkins Hospital told me that the pain beneath my ribs is not age, not nerves, not womanly complaint, but cancer of the liver, and that I should put my affairs in order before winter finishes what autumn has begun. He said it kindly. Doctors often mistake kindness for quiet voices, but he did not lie to me, and for that I have thanked him in my prayers. I came home on the train and found the shop waiting, as it always has, smelling of alcohol, beeswax, walnut, cloves, and damp brick. I unlocked the door before dawn because I could not sleep. I stood at the counter where my mother had stood, and her mother before her, and for a moment I felt all of us arranged in one room, not as ghosts, but as work left unfinished. This trade began before the sign did. My great-grandmother, Bridget Bell, came from County Clare, Ireland in 1848, after hunger had taken 2 brothers and a child she never named again. She landed in Baltimore with a linen bundle, a rosary, and more knowledge of roots and fevers than any city physician would have admitted from a poor Irish woman. In 1852, she married Amos Bell, a cooper's son from Talbot County, and came down to the Marsh Road when this place was still more water than map. Their daughter, Lydia Bell, born 1855, learned the plants from Bridget and the accounts from Amos. Lydia was the first to sell remedies from this building, though it was then only one front room, a stove and a counter made from old ship planks. She kept records from 1879 onward, and she wrote down not only what people bought, but what the weather had done to their bodies. In 1883, Lydia married Edwin Donnelly, a carpenter from Kent Island whose father had come from Cork. Edwin built the walnut cabinet you are standing near, if the room has not fallen down around it. He made the drawers narrow to keep the herbs dry and the secret place narrower still to keep our fear from spending what our wisdom should save. Their son was my father, Samuel Donnelly Bell, born 1886, and I was his only child who lived past infancy. My mother, Alice Mercer Bell, came from Hooper's Island and brought with her the marsh knowledge of women who knew how to keep fish, babies, and men alive through wet winters. From her I learned poultices. From father I learned accounts. From grandmother Lydia I learned that every bottle must tell the truth, even when the person asking for it wants comfort instead. We were never rich. Do not let the coins mislead you. Those pieces were kept one by one through influenza, crop failure, storms, funeral expenses, war telegrams, and the long hunger of the Depression. Some came from grateful hands, some came from sales of land we could no longer work. Some were hidden because women in our family knew that paper can burn, banks can fail, and men with soft voices can call prudence disobedience when money is within reach. If you're hungry when you read this, I understand the cruelty of asking you to wait. I have known hunger that made my hands shake while measuring medicine for others. I have watered soup. I have worn the same wool dress through 3 winters. I have owed money to men who smiled while writing the amount down, so I will not say do not spend. I will say only this: spend as a keeper spends, save the life before you save the house, save the hand before you save the tool, but do not trade inheritance for comfort you can borrow from a little more patience. The shop closed not because the work ended, but because the world became afraid of the old names for care. On April 12, 1938, the county inspector came with 2 papers and a young assistant who would not meet my eyes. There had been a complaint after a child in town died of pneumonia. The child had never entered my door. I had sent the mother to a physician at once, as my record book shows, but grief wants an address, and ours was an old one. The inspector said that unlabeled preparations, unlicensed practice, and outdated compounds could no longer be tolerated. He spoke as if he were sweeping dust from a table. I closed the front door that afternoon and did not reopen it for trade. For more than 30 years before that day, we had already been losing ground. Patent medicines came by catalogue. Pharmacies in Cambridge sold bright bottles with printed promises. Doctors acquired machines and degrees and waiting rooms with electric fans. Some of that was good. I am not foolish enough to scorn what saves a life. Insulin is a mercy. Ether is a mercy. Clean surgery is a mercy. People began to believe that whatever came in a package must be wiser than what their grandmothers had tended with clean hands and honest notes. Then came war. My husband, Joseph Bell, died of influenza in 1919 before he could learn to live after the army sent him home from Camp Meade. My brother, Thomas Edwin Bell, whose medal lies with this letter, was wounded in France during the Meuse-Argonne in October 1918 and died in a field hospital before Armistice Day could reach him. My son Andrew enlisted with the Navy in 1940, against my pleading and perhaps because of it. He writes from Norfolk when he can. I do not know what this new war will ask of him. Mothers are not told the price in advance. If Andrew does not return, and if I die before placing this letter into a living hand, then the house must wait for whoever still carries the patience to read before taking. Now attend to the work, because sentiment without instruction is only fog. For comfrey salve, use leaf only, never root for broken skin, and dry it until the midrib snaps. Infuse 1 part dried leaf by weight to 5 parts olive oil by measure. Keep the jar in a water bath between 110 and 125 degrees for 6 hours, never hotter. Strain through boiled muslin. Add 1 ounce clean beeswax to every 8 ounces infused oil. Melt slow. Stir with wood. Pour at once into tins warmed near the stove so the salve does not pit. For elderberry syrup, use ripe berries stripped clean of stem. 2 pounds berries to 1 quart water. Simmer 25 minutes. Do not boil hard. Crush, strain, and return liquid to low heat with 1 pound honey for each pint of juice. Add 1 tablespoon cider vinegar only after the heat is off. Bottle hot. Mark the date. Discard after 3 months unless sealed by proper canning. For willow bark, gather from living branches no thicker than your thumb in early spring when the sap is rising. Do not wring the tree. Never take from 1 willow what leaves it poorer. Dry the bark in strips. Steep 1 teaspoon dried bark in 1 cup water held just below simmer for 15 minutes. Tell anyone who bleeds easily, carries child, or cannot take aspirin that this is not for them. The old ways are not gentle when used ignorantly. For tinctures, use clear grain alcohol when lawful and available. 80 to 100 proof for leaves and flowers, stronger for roots if you can obtain it. Fill the jar halfway with dried material or 3/4 with fresh. Cover fully by 2 fingers width. Cap tight, label with plant, part, place, date, and moon if you must, though I believe weather teaches more than moon. Shake daily for 4 weeks. Strain, bottle in amber glass, and never sell what you have not tested in your own record keeping. Remember this, above all, the craft is not the bottle. The craft is attention. It is knowing when not to give, when to send for a doctor, when to sit beside a bed, because no medicine remains but presence. It is refusing to make mystery where measurement is needed and refusing to make machinery where tenderness is enough. Inheritance is a difficult word. People think it means receiving what the dead have saved. More often, it means agreeing to carry what the dead could not finish. If you have opened the hidden drawer, then you have found tools, money, seeds, and sorrow. None of these belong to you the way a coat belongs to you. They belong to the work, and for a time the work may belong to your hands. Do not trouble yourself with restoring our name. Names have their season. Do not seek revenge on those who let the place fall. Decay comes to every house, and blame repairs nothing. If there are herbs again, let them be honest. If there is a fire again, let it warm someone cold. If there is money enough, keep most of it for the next keeper, because the future always arrives poorer than we expect, and more deserving than we know. I have placed Thomas's medal here because no family should be asked to remember only its women's labour and not its men's sacrifice. If you can, see that he is honoured where the military dead are named. If you cannot, say his name aloud once, and that will be more than silence. There is another marker, should the yard remain. Behind the house, beneath the western walnut, Edwin set an iron horseshoe into the trunk when our daughter Mary survived scarlet fever in 1903. The tree grew around it. If it is still there, put your hand on the bark and know that this house has seen children spared and children buried, and still the spring returned. I will leave the blue bottles on the upper shelf because I cannot bear to pack them. My mother said blue glass keeps a little sky even indoors. I have not found that to be scientifically persuasive, but I have found it useful on days when the clouds stay low. If you are alone, you are not the first. If you are afraid, you are not unworthy. If you're poor, count carefully and be ashamed of nothing. If you are angry, clean something before you decide. If you're tempted to sell it all and vanish, eat first. Sleep once, then read this again. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor Donnelly Bell, Bell Donnelly Apothecary, Church Creek Road, October 17th, 1941. Maeve reached the signature and kept looking at it after the words had ended. The stove ticked softly as the small fire inside it began to catch. A bead of water moved down the inside of the front window and stopped where the glass had gone cloudy. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse scratched once and then withdrew. The room had not changed. The roof still needed work. The floor was still uncertain in the back. The county still had its deadlines, its forms, its authority to condemn what could not be made safe. But the room had become inhabited by names. Bridget, Lydia, Edwin, Samuel, Alice, Eleanor, Joseph, Thomas, Andrew, Mary. Names that had not come demanding anything. Names that had waited inside paper, metal, wood, and a drawer labelled for sleep. Maeve read the letter again from the first line. The second reading took longer, not because the handwriting was difficult, but because the words had begun to attach themselves to objects in the room. Edwin's cabinet, the blue bottles, the incised ruler along the work surface, the stopped calendar, the tincture drawers, the hidden compartment built not to hoard wealth but to protect a possibility from fear, hunger, men, banks, fire, and time. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases. Each fold remembered its place. She slid the pressed lavender back where it had rested and returned the pages to the envelope. Not sealing it, only tucking the flap inside. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She placed the letter beside Ruthie Bell's cracked bottle, the brass scale, the herb knife, the tweezers, the packets of seeds, the wax, the medal, and the covered coins. Then she stood, slowly because her knees had stiffened in the cold, and went out the back door. The yard looked different under the weight of instruction. Not prettier. Not kinder. Only legible in places it had been mute. The western walnut stood farther from the house than the pear by the road, beyond the pump and a little to the left of the outhouse. It was the largest tree on the property, broad through the trunk, with limbs rising at angles like arms that had carried too much and kept carrying. The ground beneath it was black, with old husks and matted leaves. The bark had grown into deep ridges, hard and furrowed, holding moss in its seams. Maeve walked around the trunk once and saw nothing. She walked again more slowly, placing one hand against the bark as she moved. The cold roughness bit into her palm. On the northern side, where the trunk swelled around an old wound, her fingers met iron. At first it looked like a dark crescent of bark, then the shape resolved, a horseshoe almost swallowed by the tree, its curved edge visible in two rusted arcs where the walnut had grown around it for decades. The nail holes had vanished beneath living wood. Only enough remained to prove Eleanor's words had not merely told memory, they had marked a place. Maeve laid her hand over it. The iron was cold, the bark around it was colder. Above her, bare branches moved slightly against the winter sky. She tried to imagine Edwin Bell standing there in 1903, pressing the horseshoe into a young trunk because a child had lived when she might have died. She imagined a mother watching from the back step. She imagined Mary, thin after fever, wrapped in a blanket, brought outside to see what had been done in gratitude for her breathing. No one had removed it. No one had known to remove it. The tree had carried the sign of that spared child through storms. Ownership changes, disrepair, condemnation, county files, and the slow forgetting of roads. Maeve kept her hand there until the cold reached the bone. Then she went back inside and opened the lower panelled door of the tincture cabinet. The left side held muslin, damaged paper, and a cracked stoneware jar. The right side held a narrow wooden box she had not yet examined. Inside were candles wrapped in oil paper, each one a little warped by heat and age, beeswax, not paraffin. Their colour had deepened from gold to amber. A note beneath them, in Eleanor's hand, read, "Poured December 1937, last good wax." Maeve lifted one candle out. It was narrow, hand-dipped, slightly uneven along the sides where each layer had cooled before the next was added. 60 years old and more, the wax had bloomed faintly white on the surface, but when she scraped a little with her thumbnail, the honey colour came through underneath. She set it in a brass holder found on the shelf above the stove, trimmed the wick with the rusted scissors, and lit it from the fire. The flame was small at first, blue at the base, then gold. It bent once toward the draught from the broken pane and righted itself. Warm light touched the work table, the tools, the letter, the bottle, the medal. The blue glass bottles on the upper shelf caught it and held it strangely, each one keeping a small piece of sky, just as Alice had said, scientific or not. Maeve stood in that narrow circle of candlelight and thought of the path that had brought her there, not as destiny, not as a grand design, but as a chain of small mercies laid down by people who had not known the next link. The grey-haired librarian in Annapolis who wrote Guest on a slip and did not ask for proof, the woman at the church office in Frederick who poured coffee into a paper cup, the nurse at the day centre who wrote staffing agencies on the back of a referral form, Mrs. Harrow who had held an old envelope in a drawer for more years than duty required, Harlan Tull who had written Maeve's name on an account card and placed soup beside chimney rods as if food was simply another tool needed for repair. None of them had saved her life in the dramatic way people like to tell. No one had appeared with a house key, a cheque, a plan, or an apology from those who had failed her. They had done smaller things which were sometimes harder because they required noticing without being asked. A guest login, a cup of coffee, a name spoken carefully, a warning before ownership, a can of soup not placed on the bill. Those kindnesses had not erased the cold. They had not made poverty gentle, but they had kept one more door from closing before she reached it. And maybe you know that kind of kindness too. Maybe someone once gave you a ride when your pride would not let you ask twice, or left food where you could find it without having to explain your hunger. Maybe a teacher, neighbour, nurse, clerk, stranger, or old friend did one practical thing at the exact hour when one practical thing was enough to keep you moving. If a small kindness ever reached you when the world felt shut, tell us about it in the comments. Not because every wound needs to be made public, but because someone else may be listening tonight who needs proof that quiet mercy still travels. By late afternoon, the candle had burned down less than an inch, and the room held a faint, clean scent of honey and smoke. Maeve spent the remaining light putting the heirlooms in order. The coins went back into their paper sleeves, then into the tin box, except for one worn silver dollar she left on the table to study later. The tools were wrapped again in cloth, but not hidden. The seeds were placed inside a dry bottle with a loose cork until she could learn whether any life remained in them. The purple heart she laid on the folded oilcloth beside the letter, its ribbon smoothed carefully with 2 fingers. She did not count the money again. That, more than anything, told her the letter had done its first work. At dusk, she made soup thin with well water and ate it beside the stove while the old candle burned on the work table. The windows had gone dark, reflecting the room back to itself. One woman, one flame, a stove, a cabinet, and a line of blue bottles holding the last of the day. Before sleeping, Maeve placed the letter inside Ruthie Bell's cracked bottle's shadow, close enough that both belonged to the same reach of her hand. She set the brass scale beside her coat, the herb knife wrapped and tucked beneath the nursing bag, and Thomas Edwin Bell's medal on the floor near her heart, where she could see it when she turned her head. The house settled. Outside, the marsh moved under darkness. Inside, the candle gave its small, deliberate light until Maeve pinched it out with damp fingers and lay down among the kept things. Not safe, not certain, but no longer unclaimed. The first snow came on December 3rd, soft at the beginning, then serious after midnight. By morning, 4.5 inches lay over the marsh road, filling the ditch, whitening the collapsed rail fence, and softening the walnut limbs until they looked less like wood than charcoal drawn under cloth. The apothecary roof, already tired before winter touched it, held the snow unevenly. On the front slope, the white lay smooth except where wind had combed it thin near the ridge. On the back slope, dark, wet patches appeared by noon, showing where heat from the stove rose through broken places, and where water had been finding the same paths for years. Maeve stood in the yard with Harlan Toll's manual under her coat, and looked up until snow slid from one cedar shingle and struck the ground at her feet. A roof was not romance. It did not care about inheritance, letters, or names scratched beneath brass scales. It kept water out, or it did not. Everything beneath it depended on that plain duty. For 3 nights she read the roofing chapter until the pages softened at the corners from her fingers. The manual explained pitch, underlayment, flashing, drip edge, course lines, fasteners, lap, exposure, ridge caps, and the quiet mathematics by which a roof became trustworthy. Maeve copied terms into the back of her pocket notebook. She drew the roof as best she could by lantern light. 22 feet across the front, 34 feet deep, 2 slopes, 1 chimney penetration, 1 rotten rear eave, 1 section near the ridge where shingles had lifted like loose scales. She measured twice and then once more because the first 2 times she had been cold enough to hurry. The building footprint gave her 748 square feet, but roof pitch added waste and risk. Harlan explained that she would need more than the rectangle suggested, especially for cuts, mistakes, and the stubborn appetite of old buildings. 3 squares, he said, writing on the counterpad. Maeve looked at the number. Is that exact? No roof is exact after 100 years. The materials list became a second winter weather report. 9 bundles of cedar shingles, utility grade but sound, at $21 per bundle. 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, $14 each. Galvanized roofing nails, 5 pounds, $4.60. 1 roll aluminum flashing, $7. Roof cement, 2 cans, $3 each. Chalk line, borrowed hammer, borrowed ladder, not borrowed, because Harlan would not trust his store ladder on frozen ground and a roof that had already lied once. He turned the account card around so she could see it. You understand this is real money? Yes, sir. You understand the county clock is not a metaphor? Yes, sir. You understand falling off a roof makes all future plans theoretical. Yes, sir. Harlan studied her for a moment, then reached beneath the back counter and brought out a tool wrapped in an old flour sack. He laid it before her and unfolded the cloth. It was a roofing hatchet, short-handled, heavy-headed, with a square striking face, a blade worn by sharpening, and a sliding gauge along the side for setting shingle exposure. The handle had been replaced at least once. The head carried small dents, not damage so much as history. My uncle used that, Harlan said. Clarence Tull. Put roofs on half the barns between here and Madison before his knees went. He died in 89. Tool has been waiting for someone stubborn or foolish enough to need it. I cannot take that. You're not taking it. You're using it. He rapped it again before she could answer. Bring it back with the handle still attached. The skilled help arrived 2 days later in the form of Owen Pritchard, who had roofed houses for 43 years and retired only because his daughter threatened to sell his ladders while he was at church. He came walking up the road at 7:10 in the morning wearing a brown canvas coat, wool cap, and boots so cracked they looked carved. His beard was white close to his face, and his eyes were pale blue with the washed clarity of winter sky. He carried his own hammer, a nail apron, and a thermos. Harlan had sent him, though Owen would not say so directly. You the nurse, he said. I was. You the one bought the Bell place. Yes, sir. He looked up at the roof, then down at the ground, then at the way Maeve had stacked shingles beneath a tarp weighted by bricks. You got hands? Yes, sir. Use them. That was the whole hiring conversation. When Maeve asked what she could pay, Owen unscrewed the lid of his thermos and poured coffee into it. Pay attention. For 11 days. They worked whenever weather allowed and stopped whenever the old man said stop. His teaching was terse, exact, and without flattery. He did not explain twice unless the second explanation required fewer words. On the first day, he made her carry shingles up and down the ladder without nailing a single one. He corrected where her boot met the rung, where her hand held the rail, how she shifted weight, how she turned near the eave. 3 points. I have 3, then act like it, on the second day. They stripped the worst of the back slope. The old cedar shingles broke under the pry bar in silver-grey flakes. Beneath them, the felt had turned to black paper lace, and in 2 places the roof deck had softened near the eave. Owen crouched, tapped with his hammer, and listened. Rot talks, he said. You listen. The rear rafter by the chimney had sagged where water had followed bad flashing for years. Owen showed her how to sister it with a new length of 2x6, laid tight against the old rafter and fastened with 16-penny galvanized nails. The new board did not erase the old. It joined it, taking weight without pretending history had not split. Flush here. Maeve adjusted the board. Again, she adjusted. He nodded once. The chalk line became her first lesson in trust and tension. Owen hooked one end at the eave, made her hold the other at the exact exposure, then snapped the blue line across the felt. The mark appeared clean, temporary, and authoritative. Shingles followed it. Not memory, not guesswork, a line. By the 4th day, her knees were bruised, her palms blistered beneath the gloves, and her shoulders ached with a deep, honest pain that sleep did not fully repair. She learned the 3-stroke nail from Owen because he refused to let her peck at fasteners until the heads shone with indecision. Set. Drive. Seat. The first stroke placed the nail. The second sent it nearly home. The third brought the head flush without crushing the shingle. When she left one high, Owen pointed with the head of his hammer. That nail's proud. Maeve pulled it. When she drove one too hard and split the cedar, he did not scold. Wasted shingle. She pulled that too. They worked under skies the colour of pewter, under a thin sun that gave light but no warmth. under wind that crossed the marsh and entered sleeves, collars, and the space beneath fingernails. At noon, Maeve heated soup on the stove and brought it out in mugs because the roof could not be left open long enough for a proper meal. Owen ate standing, looking at the work instead of at her. On the 7th day, Harlan came with flashing and a packet of biscuits from Doris's cafe in town. He set both on the counter and said nothing about the fact that the biscuits were warm. On the 9th day, the chimney flashing went in. Owen made Maeve cut each piece, bend each edge, and understand why water must always be given a path away from weakness, step flashing along the courses, counter flashing let into a mortar joint, roof cement only where roof cement belonged, not slathered over ignorance like frosting. Tar is not skill, Owen said. By December 15th, the last ridge cap was nailed. They stood in the yard at dusk, both looking up. The new cedar was pale against the old brick and grey siding, raw and almost too clean for the building beneath it. The roofline remained imperfect because the building itself was not straight, but the shingles lay in disciplined courses, the flashing shone dully at the chimney, and the rear eave no longer showed daylight through its teeth. Owen took off his gloves and flexed his fingers. Water will have to work harder now. Maeve almost smiled. That means it is done. Nothing's done. That part will hold. He left with his thermos and nail apron, walking back toward the road as the evening turned blue around him. Maeve carried Clarence Toll's roofing hatchet inside, wiped the handle with a dry rag, and set it on the work table beside the brass scale and herb knife. That night, snowmelt slid down the new roof and fell cleanly from the eaves, missing the walls for the first time in years. Maeve lay awake and listened to water being turned away. 5B, January. The chimney. January came in hard, with clear mornings and temperatures that stayed in the 20s even after noon. The roof had bought time. The chimney demanded trust. From the outside, the brick stack looked upright enough to comfort a person who did not know brick. Owen had warned her not to be comforted. Up close, the trouble showed in the face of each course. The upper bricks were spalling, their fired skins flaking away in red scales after years of freeze and thaw. The mortar between them had powdered to sand in places. When Maeve pressed one joint with the tip of Harlan's borrowed screwdriver, pale grit fell out and scattered over the shingles. Inside, the chimney breast in the workroom had hairline cracks running down from the thimble-like veins. A chimney could appear solid while preparing to betray a house from within. That was one of the first sentences in the manual's chapter on masonry, and Maeve copied it into her notebook because it sounded like advice for more than brick. Harlan came out to inspect it on the second Saturday of the month, bringing a mason's trowel, a joint rake, a stiff brush, and a bucket of dry mix he had prepared himself. Portland cement is too hard for this old brick, he said. You trap moisture. Brick loses the argument. He opened the bucket and showed her the pale powder. Hydraulic lime. 3 parts sharp sand, Vone part. Fire clay for the inner joints near heat. Half part. Small batches. Peanut butter. Not soup. Maeve wrote it down. Hydraulic lime 3. Sharp sand 1. Fire clay 1/2 near heat. Dampen brick first. Pack deep. Tool joint. Keep from freezing. Do not mix more than you can place in 20 minutes, Harlan said. Do not work when the brick is frozen. Do not let fresh mortar freeze. Do not decide you are smarter than water. Yes, sir. He looked at the stove, then at the wall. You can use it small while you work, but no roaring fire. Heat, gentle. Brick needs persuasion, not punishment. The repair took 3 weeks because the weather allowed only pieces of days. Maeve began from inside, raking out joints around the thimble with the narrow tool until her wrists ached. The old mortar came away in dry crumbs, then in stubborn ledges that had to be picked clean. She brushed each joint, vacuumed dust with a hand pump device Harlan loaned from the store. then misted the brick with warmed water from a spray bottle, so the old masonry would not steal moisture too quickly from the new mortar. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for the smaller joints, so she worked with fingers exposed until they lost feeling, then stepped back to the stove and held them near the iron until pain returned in bright needles. She learned to welcome the pain because it meant her hands were still willing to report. The skin around her nails cracked. Lime found the cracks and stung. At night, she rubbed them with a little beeswax softened near the stove, not the old wax from Eleanor's hidden package, but a newer cake, Harlan added to the account after seeing her knuckles. Hands are tools, he said. Maintain them. On the chimney exterior, Owen helped rig a roof ladder from 2 planks and hooks, though he declared himself retired from anything requiring grace. Maeve worked from the ladder while the marsh wind came hard from the south and shook her coat. She removed loose mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch wherever the joints had failed. She replaced only the bricks that crumbled in her hand. Harlan found salvaged soft brick from a shed behind the store, close enough in age and hardness not to shame the old stack. The work had a rhythm unlike roofing. Roofing moved by coverage. Chimney repair moved by depth. Scrape, brush, dampen, press, pack, tool, wait, keep warm, begin again. She learnt the difference between pointing a joint and merely smearing mortar across its face. A smeared joint looked reassuring for one season and failed by the next thaw. A packed joint entered the wall and became part of its resistance. Harlan made her redo 5 feet of work after he found a shallow place. That is decoration. Maeve scraped it out. By the 3rd week, she could judge the mortar by sound as much as sight. Too dry. It rasped against the trowel and refused the joint. Too wet. It sagged and shone. Right? It held its shape like something willing to be persuaded into permanence. She worked through afternoons when the light left early and mornings when frost feathered the inside of the front window. She tied canvas around the chimney crown to shield fresh joints from wind. At night she kept the stove low but steady, waking every few hours to add 1 split of wood and check the thermometer Harlan had nailed beside the chimney breast. The room stayed cold enough to make sleep difficult but warm enough that the mortar did not freeze. Late on January 27th, the test fire burned clean. Harlan stood in the workroom with his cap in his hands, looking not at the flames, but at the draught. Owen stood outside by the walnut tree, watching the chimney top. Maeve fed the stove a small armload of dry oak Caleb from down the road, had split for her without yet giving his name. The fire took, deepened and settled. Smoke drew upward without wandering into the room. The chimney warmed slowly, no crack opened, no soot smell thickened, no wind pushed smoke back through the thimble. After 10 minutes, Owen called from outside. Clean, Harlan nodded. Again tomorrow. Still small. Maeve stood with both hands held near the stove, palms open, not because she was cold, though she was, but because the room had accepted fire more fully than before. The flame moved behind the stove door with a steady orange concentration. Heat entered the bricks, then the air, then the objects around it, kettle, work table, cabinet, floor, bone-handled knife, Ruthie Bell's bottle, Eleanor's letter folded in its envelope. That night, the apothecary did not become warm. Winter still owned the walls, but smoke went where it was supposed to go. 5C, late January, the floors. The floors waited until after the chimney because floors were the place where every other task had to stand. Once the roof no longer leaked freely and the chimney no longer threatened the room with smoke, Maeve began lifting, cleaning, fastening and sanding the white pine planks that ran through the front room and into the workroom. She had been walking over them for weeks, learning which boards complained, which boards dipped, which boards held a nail proud enough to tear wool socks. Now she knelt and studied them as if they were patients with long records and no reliable witnesses. The planks were hand-cut, wider than modern lumber, some nearly 14 inches across, their edges softened by feet that had crossed them for generations. In places, rosehead nails still held them, black with age and hammered by hand. Each nail had a small irregular head, not round and neat like modern fasteners, but faceted, catching light differently depending on where Maeve stood. Harlan told her not to pull them unless she had to. "Those nails are part of the floor's memory," he said. Memory or not, several had worked loose. She set what she could with a nail punch borrowed from the store, tapping them below the surface so the sander would not strike metal. Where boards had lifted or cupped, she worked slowly, humidifying the worst with damp towels near the stove and weighting them with bricks for days before fastening. Where the maintenance man had once put his boot through a plank near the workroom, she cut out only the failed length and patched with old pine. Harlan had salvaged from a church closet renovation. "New pine will shout," he said. "Old pine will speak at the same table." The patch did not disappear. It did not need to. Its grain ran close enough. Its colour not yet right but willing. On January 30, Harlan loaded a random orbit floor sander into the back of his truck and brought it himself because, in his words, no sane person dragged rental equipment 2 miles by hand. The rental price was $14 a day, plus discs. He wrote it on the account card, then paused. 2 days, Maeve said. 1, if you do not admire your own suffering. 2, she said. He gave her sanding discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, and 220. Do not start with 40 unless you want to erase a century. Keep it moving. Let the machine work. Corners by hand. Dust mask always. Vacuum between passes. Dust is not seasoning. The first pass with 80 grit frightened her. The machine hummed with a blunt, muscular force that travelled through her arms and into her shoulders. It wanted to wander. She guided it with both hands, moving with the grain, slow enough to cut, not so slow that it hollowed the plank. The grey upper layer lifted in pale dust. Beneath it colour appeared. Not fresh, not new, but living. Dark honey near the front windows. Deeper amber where sun had not reached. In the workroom, under the cabinet's shadow, the pine held a reddish depth that approached mahogany. She stopped often to vacuum. The dust filled everything despite the bag attached to the sander. It settled in her hair, along the stove lip, on the blue bottles, across the windowsills, into the cracks of her knuckles. She sealed the tincture cabinet with muslin and tape as best she could, wrapped the letter, medal tools and coins, and moved them to the front bench beneath a cloth. Still the dust found the air. Old wood becoming visible is a messy resurrection. The second pass, 120 grit, quieted the room. The machine no longer fought her as hard. Scratches from the first pass softened. Grain emerged in long rivers. Nail heads became little dark stars set just below the surface. The rosehead nails, where she had protected them, remained as evidence of hands that had built before electricity, before power sanders, before the word restoration became something printed in magazines. The third pass, 220, took almost no wood. It gave the floor back to touch. Maeve worked the corners by hand with folded paper, moving in small circles until her fingers stiffened, along the counter, beneath the front bench, under the work table, before the tincture cabinet. She did not make the floor perfect. Perfection would have required aggression. She removed splinters, rot stains, raised grain, and the grey film of abandonment, but she left the deeper scars, burns near the stove, a dark ring where some jar had leaked, a crescent gouge near the rear door, the faint line where a threshold had once divided shop from work. Then came oil. Harlan recommended pure tung oil for the highest wear places and boiled linseed oil cut, with citrus solvent for the first nourishing coat where the boards were dry as bone. Maeve bought only what she needed. The first coat went down thin, rubbed by hand with rags because brushes left too much. The wood drank it so quickly she could almost hear thirst. Dark honey became deeper. Amber became brown sugar. The reddish boards near the cabinet turned toward mahogany, not polished, not grand, but rich with the accumulated light of years uncovered. She waited 48 hours before the second coat. Waiting became work too. Keep dust down. Keep the stove small. Keep boots off. Keep mice from crossing wet oil if possible, though one left tiny prints near the back door that she later sanded lightly and allowed to remain because the alternative was anger at a creature also looking for warmth. The second coat cured 48 hours. Then the third. By the time the floors were done, Maeve could walk barefoot from the front door to the stove without catching skin on a splinter. She did it once at night, carrying the old candle in its brass holder, feeling the boards cool beneath her feet. The place looked less abandoned than awake. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without drama on February 6th after 3 days of floor work, 2 nights of poor sleep, and a dawn when the pump handle froze to her glove. Maeve woke with a heaviness so complete that even sitting upright felt like negotiating with stone. The account card at Tull's had grown long. The county deadline had not grown farther away. The roof held, but the walls still needed work. The chimney drew, but wood had to be split. The floor shone, but the windows leaked wind. Every repaired thing revealed 6 unrepaired things waiting behind it. She made coffee too weak to deserve the name and forgot to drink it. At 9 o'clock, she took the axe outside to split kindling and missed the same piece of wood 3 times. The third strike glanced off, buried itself in frozen ground, and sent pain up her arm. She stood there looking at the axe handle, the wood, the yard, the shop, the walnut tree, the iron horseshoe, the white sky. Then she put the axe down. No one saw. No one scolded. That was part of the loneliness and part of the mercy. She walked past the outhouse, past the pump, down to the marsh edge where the ground softened and the brown winter grass gave way to reeds. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the wind touching the long feathers at its neck. Maeve sat on a fallen log with her coat pulled tight and watched the bird watch the water. For 2 hours, neither of them improved anything. The heron lifted 1 foot slowly, placed it down, waited, then struck so fast the movement seemed to belong to another animal. It swallowed, resumed stillness, and let the world come back around it. Maeve stayed until cold entered through the seat of her jeans and her hands had gone stiff in her pockets. She did not pray. She did not make a new plan. She did not convert exhaustion into wisdom for the sake of feeling useful. She simply did not work that day. Near dusk, she returned to the apothecary, lit the stove, and ate bread Doris had left in a paper bag by the front step. The floors caught the firelight and held it low, dark honey shading to mahogany near the cabinet. The boards did not ask why she had rested. They had waited a century. They could wait 1 day more. 5D, February, the windows. February made the bad windows impossible to ignore. Wind did not enter the apothecary like a single draft. It arrived as a committee, each member with a separate complaint. It whistled through the broken front pane, breathed beneath the sash near the counter, pushed through gaps where putty had failed, and slipped around the rear window that had been boarded from inside with warped pine. The stove fought it bravely and lost more often than not. There were 8 windows in all. 3 had no glass, only boards or cardboard layered by former hands. 4 were cracked, some in single clean lines, some in wandering breaks like lightning frozen in place. One window, the high narrow sash in the back room above the tincture cabinet, still held its original wavy glass. Harlan dated it not precisely but respectfully. Could be 1788, he said. Squinting up at it, could be near enough that replacing it would be a sin. The glass had tiny bubbles suspended in it and bent the light slightly, making the blue bottles below seem to tremble when viewed from the room's centre. Maeve wrote in her notebook, "Do not replace." For the rest, Harlan supplied salvaged panes from storm windows stacked behind his store. He showed her how to measure the rabbet, not just the opening, and subtract enough for glass to move with weather. Too tight, it would crack. Too loose, it would rattle and leak. Window work required a different patience from roof or brick. It was close work, hand work, the kind of repair that punished haste with broken glass. Maeve removed each sash when she could and worked on the front counter over a folded blanket, where sash cords had rotted. She opened the side pockets and found the counterweights still waiting inside the wall, dark iron cylinders hanging in dusty cavities. She bought quarter-inch cotton sash cord and learned the figure-8 knot Harlan insisted would not slip. "Not a granny knot," he said. "The window will know." She tied the cord through the weight eye, made the figure-8, dressed it tight, and lifted the weight by the line to test it. The first knot failed. The weight dropped 6 inches inside the wall and struck wood with a hard, corrective thud. Harlan looked at her. The window knew. She tied it again. The glazing putty came in a tub labelled DAP 33, cream-coloured and stiff until warmed in the hands. Maeve rolled it into thin ropes between her palms, pressed it into the rabbit, seated the glass carefully, set glazier's points with the edge of the putty knife, then laid the final bevel of putty along the outside. At first her bevels were lumpy and overworked. Harlan scraped one clean and made her watch. Knife low. Pressure steady. 1 pass if you can. 2 if you must. More than that, and you're playing with it. By the 3rd window, her lines improved. By the 5th, they were modest but honest. The cracked panes came out in careful pieces wrapped in newspaper. Some broke further as she lifted them, releasing little bright sounds that made her shoulders tighten. She swept after every removal, then swept again, because glass in an old floor could wait years for a bare foot. The boards she had just restored seemed to deserve better than hidden shards. Outside, the weather shifted between sleet, thaw, and cold rain. Inside, each repaired window altered the sound of the room. The front room stopped breathing through its teeth. The bench beneath the windows became a place a person could sit without bracing against wind. Dust moved less. The candle flame stood straighter. The stove, freed from constant argument, began to hold a coal bed into morning. She saved the original backroom window for cleaning only. The sash was too fragile to remove, so she climbed onto a stool and worked with vinegar water, cotton cloth, and a patience that felt almost ceremonial. The wavy glass cleared in layers, first the surface dust, then the greasy soot, then the mineral film left by years of damp. As she cleaned, winter light entered the room through glass that had seen the shop before the letter, before condemnation, before the inspector, before war medals were hidden in Valerian drawers. When she finished, the tincture cabinet stood beneath a soft, uneven brightness. The last window was the small one over the rear work table. Its lower rail had swollen from water, and the sash refused to move. Maeve worked it for half a morning with a putty knife, wax and restraint. Force would have split the frame. Patience finally opened it a quarter-inch, then an inch, then enough for her to lift it free and lay it on the counter. The glass was gone entirely, the old putty reduced to grey crumbs. She cleaned the rabbit, sanded the loose paint, primed bare wood, and fitted a salvaged pane with a faint scratch across one corner. By late afternoon, the putty bevel was done. She rehung the sash, tied the cord, tested the weight, and lowered the window into place. It moved smoothly, not like new, but like something old relieved to be useful again. Outside, on the walnut branch nearest the rear wall, a chickadee landed. Maeve stood with one hand still on the sash cord and watched it through the repaired glass. The bird was very small, black-capped, round against the cold, its feet gripping the branch with complete confidence. It tilted its head toward the window, then toward the yard, then flicked away into the brush as if the inspection had satisfied it. The room held still after it left. Maeve touched the putty line once, lightly, then stepped back from the window. 8 openings had become windows again. Not perfect. Not elegant, but they held glass, weight, cord, putty, weather, and view. That evening, when the stove settled and the candle burned on the work table, Maeve sat beneath the backroom window with Eleanor's letter open beside her and listened to wine strike the outside of the house without entering. The plaster announced its failure only after the windows began to hold. Before that wind had hidden many sins. Cold air moved through cracks and gaps with such confidence that one more draught near the chimney seemed ordinary. But once the sashes were repaired, once the DAP-33 cured along the glass and the cotton cords held the weights, Maeve began to feel the walls themselves. 3 patches near the chimney had loosened from the hand-split oak lath beneath. They did not fall all at once. They bellied outward, powdering at the edges, making faint dusty sighs whenever the stove warmed the bricks. Harlan stood in the workroom on a late February morning and pressed one patch with 2 fingers. "That will come down," he said. Maeve looked at the wall. All of it? No. Just what has already quit. The original plaster was horsehair plaster, laid over oak lath split by hand and fastened with old cut nails. When Maeve removed the failed sections, she found the lath beneath still mostly sound, narrow strips of oak darkened by age, each with its rough face turned outward to hold the plaster keys. Where the plaster had failed, those keys had broken behind the lath and fallen into the wall cavity like old teeth. She worked carefully with a putty knife and small pry bar, removing loose plaster only until the remaining edges rang firm when tapped. Dust filled the room in pale bursts. The fallen material came away in layers. Thin white finish coat, thicker brown coat, rough scratch coat with strands of hair still visible. Some hairs were black, some were grey. Harlan said horsehair. Most likely, though, he admitted that in older houses a person sometimes found whatever hair had been available and clean enough to mix. Behind the opened patches, the wall looked honest. Lath, gaps, shadow, the back of old work. Harlan brought a paper sack from his storeroom, folded over twice and tied with string. "My father bought this in the 50s, he said. Horsehair. Never used the rest. The hair inside had been kept dry, coiled and springy, smelling faintly of dust and barn loft. Maeve touched it with the same caution she gave old letters. It was only material, but it had weighted too. The mix was lime-based, not modern joint compound, because the old wall needed something that could breathe with it. Harlan helped her measure the first batch: lime putty, sharp sand, a small handful of chopped horsehair pulled apart with fingers, and enough water to bring it to a thick, sticky body. For the scratch coat, he made it rougher. For the brown coat, heavier and truer. For the finish, fine and thin. 3 coats, he said. Do not cheat time. The scratch coat went on first, pressed hard through the lath gaps so it mushroomed behind and formed new keys. Maeve scored it with a scrap of wood, drawing shallow horizontal lines so the next coat could grip. It was ugly work and satisfying. The wall accepted pressure. The plaster clung. The room smelled mineral, damp and clean. The brown coat came after the scratch had stiffened, 3/8 of an inch, Harlan said, and he meant it. Maeve learned to judge thickness by eye, then checked with a nail marked at the proper depth. Too thin, and the patch would be weak. Too thick, and it would slump or crack. She feathered the edges toward the old plaster, not hiding the repair, but making it belong. Then the waiting. 72 hours. During those days she kept the stove gentle and the room steady. Too much heat would dry the plaster too quickly. Too much cold would keep it from setting. She misted the patches lightly when Harlan told her to, watching the surface darken and then pale again. The work demanded restraint more than effort. Do not touch. Do not hurry. Do not decide the wall is ready simply because you're tired of waiting. The finish coat was the smallest and most difficult, 1/8 of an inch, smooth but not polished, worked with a damp trowel until it met the old wall without argument. Maeve's first pass left ridges, her second made one corner worse. She stepped back, breathed once, cleaned the trowel, and tried again with less pressure. By evening, 3 new patches held around the chimney, pale against the older wall. Visible in the way healing is visible before time, and use soften it. The room did not look new. It looked repaired. Maeve sat on the floor, back against the tincture cabinet, and looked at the patches while the stove breathed heat through the room. These patches will hold another 100 years, she said. The words surprised her because no one was there to hear them. but the wall heard enough. 5F. Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd. Doris first appeared as a paper bag. Maeve found it on the granite step one morning after sleet had fallen and frozen along the ditch. The bag had been folded down twice and tucked inside a larger flour sack to keep it dry. Inside were 4 biscuits wrapped in a clean towel, a jar of oyster stew sealed tight, 2 apples, and a note written on the back of a cafe receipt. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." No signature. Maeve knew it was Doris because Harlan had mentioned her name whenever food appeared without explanation, always in a tone that suggested Doris did not require permission to feed anyone within 6 miles of her stove. Doris owned the cafe in Cambridge with the oyster stew chalkboard, though everyone called it Doris's whether the painted sign said Bay Light Cafe. She was a compact woman with iron grey hair pinned close, brown forearms strong from years of lifting stock pots, and an apron that never stayed clean past 9 in the morning. When Maeve finally walked in to thank her, Doris was behind the counter slicing pie with the concentration of a surgeon. "I found the food," Maeve said. Doris did not look up. "Good. That was the plan. I cannot pay for it yet. Did I ask for money?" "No, ma'am." "Then you answered a question nobody put to you." She slid a cup of coffee across the counter and nodded toward a stool. The cafe smelled of onions, coffee, butter, vinegar, fried oysters, and raincoats drying near the door. Men in work jackets sat along the far wall. A woman with a toddler paid for toast and eggs in coins. No one stared at Maeve long, but everyone noticed her, then kindly returned to their plates. Doris wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked at her directly. "You living out there?" "Yes, ma'am." "Foolish?" "Yes, ma'am." Brave and foolish are cousins. People confuse them. Maeve held the coffee with both hands. "I will pay in candles." Doris nodded once. "When the shop reopens." The phrase did not sound like encouragement. It sounded like a practical appointment placed on a calendar Maeve had not yet seen. After that, paper bags appeared every few days. Beans, biscuits, stew, cornbread, a jar of pickled beets, once a small square of spice cake wrapped in wax paper. Doris never left more than could be accepted without shame, and never so little that it failed to matter. Caleb came with a splitting maul and a red Schwinn bicycle. He was 16 or 17, long-limbed and narrow as a sapling, with a face still undecided between boy and man. His coat was too large at the shoulders, his gloves mismatched, and his hair stuck out from beneath a knit cap in damp brown pieces. He rode up on a Saturday morning while Maeve was trying to split oak rounds behind the pump, and failing at the ones with twisted grain. He watched for 3 swings before speaking. "You are hitting across the knot." Maeve leaned on the axe handle and looked at him. "Is that why the wood hates me?" He considered this seriously. "Mostly." He got off the bicycle, laid it carefully near the fence, and picked up his maul from where it had been strapped along the frame with 2 bungee cords. Without asking, he set a round upright, turned it until a hairline crack faced him, and split it with 1 clean downward motion. The wood opened like it had been waiting for his opinion. "I am Maeve," she said. "Caleb." He split 6 more rounds before she could decide whether to object. "I cannot pay you," my mother said. He set another round on the stump. "About your grandfather." Maeve was silent. "My mother said my grandfather got medicine here when he was little. Fever. Bellwoman brought it out herself during a storm." He swung again. The round split. She said if you needed wood, I should split wood. His mother, Maeve learned later, cleaned rooms at a motel in Cambridge and had no extra money, but possessed the kind of authority that could send a teenage boy down a winter road with a maul and make him call it ordinary. Caleb came twice a week after that, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3. He did not talk much unless asked about bicycles, baseball, or whether a particular piece of wood would split cleanly. He refused money every time with increasing irritation, as if payment would insult his mother more than him. "Eat before you leave," Maeve said one evening, holding out a bowl of stew Doris had sent. He took it. That, too, was Labour. Reverend Boyd entered the story by passing. Every morning near 7:30, he walked along the marsh road in a dark wool coat and a hat with a brim polished by weather. He was tall, stooped slightly at the shoulders, and carried a walking stick that seemed more ceremonial than necessary. The first week, he tipped his hat from the road and kept going. The second, he crossed the ditch by the flat stones and stood near the walnut trees without approaching the door. Morning. Miss Donnelly. Morning. Reverend. She knew his title only because Doris had told her. He looked at the roof, the windows, the smoke rising clean from the chimney. Work is visible, yes, sir. He did not offer advice. He did not ask whether she was saved, lonely, foolish, legal, hungry, or afraid. Each morning, he passed, tipped his hat, and prayed in motion, 4 words so quietly spoken that Maeve heard them only when the wind favoured her. Lord, keep her steady. Not safe, not successful, not blessed beyond hardship. Steady. The prayer came to feel like one more repair, small and invisible, placed somewhere in the walls where a person could not see it but might lean against it without knowing. 5G, cellar plus Easter egg planted. Maeve postponed the cellar until February 11th. At first, there had been enough danger above ground, roof, chimney, windows, walls, floor. The cellar door, set in the back room beneath a slanted wooden hatch near the work table, could wait because the work she could see already had teeth. But after the plaster patches were holding, and the stove no longer argued with wind, the closed hatch began to feel less like delay and more like avoidance. Harlan lent her a lantern, a pry bar, and his oldest advice, do not step where you cannot see. The hatch had swollen in its frame. Maeve worked the pry bar gently along the edge, careful not to splinter the tongue and groove boards. When it lifted, gold air rose from below, damp and mineral, carrying the smell of stone, earth, old potatoes, and time without daylight. 7 granite steps led down. They were narrow, worn in the centre, and green at the edges where moisture had kept its own weather. Maeve swept each one before trusting it. The lantern threw light ahead in a soft yellow circle, and the cellar accepted it without returning much. At the bottom, the floor opened into a 12 by 15-foot room lined with fieldstone walls. The stones were irregular, some the size of a fist, some broad as loaves, set in old lime mortar that had held better than it had any right to. The ceiling beams above were low enough that Maeve had to bow her head. Roots had entered at one corner in fine pale threads. A shelf along the north wall held empty crocks, 2 broken jugs, and a wooden crate labelled Ball Mason in faded blue. The fieldstone floor was mostly flat, though damp in the corners. In the centre lay a single dressed granite slab unlike the rest of the floor. It was rectangular, smooth along the edges, and set level with the surrounding stones. On its face, someone had carved a mark, a small mortar and pestle enclosed in a circle, the pestle angled diagonally across the bowl. The craft mark. Maeve crouched and brushed dust from the grooves. The slab did not belong to a casual repair. It had been placed with intention. The pry bar in her hand felt suddenly improper. She did not lift it. Not because she lacked curiosity. Curiosity had brought her to the hidden drawer. The letter, the horseshoe, the old names waiting inside paper. But the letter had also taught sequence. Some doors opened when the hand was ready. Some knowledge spoiled when taken, only because it could be taken. She set the lantern on a crate and stood, looking at the slab until the mark seemed to look back. Not yet, she said. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something under the 3rd step. The sound was not stone, not wood exactly. A small hollow knock. Maeve stopped, lowered the lantern, and saw a narrow space beneath the overhang of the step where the riser had pulled back from the side wall. Something had been wedged there, half hidden by dust and a fallen curl of bark. She reached in carefully and drew out a small oak box, no longer than her hand from wrist to fingertip. It had no lock, only a sliding lid, swollen but movable with slow pressure. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was small, finer than a door key, its shaft darkened, its bit cut in 2 careful steps. The bow had been shaped like the same mortar and pestle carved into the granite slab. Maeve held it under the lantern and watched dull light gather along the worn edges. The photograph was wrapped in tissue that had browned nearly to the colour of tea. She unfolded it on the crate. A young woman stood in front of the apothecary in summer light. The building behind her was unmistakable. The same front door, the same bracket for the sign, the same proportions before weather had leaned into them. The young woman wore a long pale dress and an apron dark at the waist. Her hair was parted in the centre and pinned back. In one hand she held a small herb knife, its bone handle visible even in the stiff old image. Her face was Maeve's face changed by time. Not identical. Not a mirror. But close enough that Maeve stepped back and struck her shoulder against a beam. The same long mouth. The same set of the eyes. The same narrow line of the nose inherited without permission from someone who had stood before this same door more than a century earlier. On the back, in ink faded brown, someone had written, Mary Bell Donnelly, daughter of Lydia Bell. Edge 25. Summer of 1903. Mary, the child who had survived scarlet fever, the horseshoe in the walnut tree, the daughter marked by gratitude and later photographed before the shop with a tool of the trade in her hand. Maeve carried the box upstairs slowly, the cellar hatch closed with a low wooden breath behind her. In the workroom, afternoon light entered through the repaired window and fell across the tincture cabinet. She set the tintype on the table beside Eleanor's letter and placed the brass key on the mantel above the stove. She did not know what it opened. The key waited there, small and exact, its bow shaped like the craft that had crossed generations through women's hands. County files, hidden drawers, and winter repairs, sometimes not knowing was its own kind of keeping. 5H, March, Aprila, spring arrives. March did not arrive all at once. It entered by thaw, withdrew by frost, then tried again. Snow retreated from the ditch in dirty ridges. The creek beyond the cattails grew loud with snowmelt, brown water pushing through marsh grass with a voice Maeve could hear from the back step. The walnut trees loosened first at the tips, then along the branches, their catkins hanging like green-brown tassels against a sky that no longer looked permanently closed. The apothecary changed under spring light. Repairs that had seemed severe in winter softened by degrees. The pale cedar shingles weathered toward silver. The lime plaster patches lost their raw brightness. The oiled floors held mourning in long amber bands. Clean glass admitted not warmth exactly, but possibility. Even the cabinet appeared less like an artifact and more like a workplace waiting for clean hands. People began to stop by without pretending they had no reason. Doris came once with a pie and inspected the front room as if measuring where tables might stand, though Maeve told her there would be no tables. Caleb brought kindling stacked so neatly by the back wall that it looked like a lesson. Reverend Boyd left a folded church bulletin on the counter with a note about the cemetery records, in case the Bell name needed tracing. Harlan came with a ledger book he claimed had been damaged and unsellable, though only one corner showed wear. Records, he said. Maeve ran her hand over the blank pages. I am not beginning yet. Good. He did not ask why. The decision had formed slowly and settled firmly. She would not begin the craft that spring. Not for sale, not for neighbours, not even for herself beyond tea, broth and simple things Ruthie Bell had taught with no claim of cure. The letter's instructions were exact, but exact instructions did not make a keeper. They made a student aware of how much could be harmed by pretending. She would order materials with one coin, only one, and only after learning its honest value from a reputable dealer in Cambridge recommended by Mrs. Harrow. She would buy amber bottles, labels, muslin, fresh beeswax, clean tins, a thermometer that could be trusted, and books written by people who knew both old plants and modern dangers. She would practice on small samples: calendula oil for cracked hands, lavender sachets for drawers, beeswax candles to pay Doris first. Nothing swallowed, nothing sold as medicine, nothing that promised more than it could keep. 1 coin would be enough to begin without hunger deciding too much. The rest would stay sealed. On April 9th, she planted the black cumin seeds from 1938 in a clay pot by the back window. Though she knew they were likely too old to rise, she planted them anyway because planting was a form of asking without demanding. Beside them she placed newer seeds from Harlan's store: calendula, yarrow, chamomile, sage, lavender. Their packets stood in a row along the sill, bright with printed colour and modest hope. The old seeds never sprouted. The new ones did. Thin, green loops broke the soil first in the calendula pot, then the chamomile. Maeve watered with a spoon so she would not drown them. In the mornings, she turned the pots by a quarter so the stems would grow straight. The work was almost nothing. It mattered. By late April she slept some nights without waking from cold. She had a cot now, bought used from a church rummage table. She had 2 blankets, a lantern, a stack of wood, and a ledger with the first page dated but otherwise blank. The county inspector had come, frowned, measured, taken photographs, and granted a longer stabilization period with language so cautious it still felt like a reprieve. Maeve pinned the paper near the front door. Not approval. Time. Time was enough. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later. In December 2024, Maeve finished the first thing that felt worthy of the room. It was not a tincture. It was not medicine. It made no claim on anyone's bloodstream, sleep, cough, fever, grief, or pain. It was a hand-dipped beeswax candle poured and drawn in layers over many afternoons, using clean local wax from an apiary outside Easton, cotton wick ordered from a supplier whose invoices she filed carefully, and the old brass holder as her measure for length. The candle was modest, slightly tapered, warm gold in colour, with a faint honey scent that appeared only when held near the face. She made 12 and kept only 1. The first went to Doris in a paper wrapping tied with linen thread. Doris turned it in her hand behind the cafe counter, inspecting it the way she inspected pie crust and poor excuses. That all, for now. Doris nodded. Good. People always want to begin too loud. She placed the candle on the shelf above the coffee urn. Not for sale. Not for display exactly. But where morning light could touch it. By then, the Apothecary had become a place one could enter without pity. The front room still held the original counter with its cracked glass corner repaired by a neat wooden frame. Behind it, shelves had been cleaned, strengthened, and sparsely filled, blue bottles on the highest shelf, amber bottles below, labelled jars of dried flowers grown in the small back garden, folded muslin, tins, paper packets, ledger books, and a row of candles cooling on a rack. The old calendar from 1958 remained on the wall, but beside it hung a current one with appointments written in pencil. The floors glowed dark honey where feet crossed most often, and deep mahogany near the cabinet. The plaster patches had cured into the wall and no longer announced themselves. The windows held winter outside. The stove, blackened but sound, kept a low fire through workdays. The tincture cabinet stood in the back room not as a shrine, but as a working inheritance. Drawers cleaned, labels rewritten only where necessary, old labels preserved beneath new ones when they could be saved. Maeve had built no grand sign, ordered no branded packaging, made no social pages, given no interviews, and allowed no newspaper photographer to pose her beside poverty turned picturesque. If people came, they came because someone told them quietly that the Bell place had light in the windows again, and that the woman there listened before answering. The brass key waited on the mantel through all of that first year. Sometimes Maeve carried it in her pocket while she worked, feeling its small-shaped bow against her fingers. She tried it in the tin box, the lower cabinet, the old desk drawer Harlan found at auction, the padlock on the rear shed, and a narrow wall cupboard behind the front counter. Nothing accepted it. She did not force anything. A key that old could outlast impatience if left alone. The answer came from the walnut tree. On a clear afternoon in February 2025, after a storm had broken 2 dead branches from the western walnut, Caleb came to help cut them down. He was taller by then, broader through the shoulders. His old Schwinn replaced by a battered pickup he drove with both windows cracked no matter the temperature. While clearing brush near the trunk, he called Maeve outside. "You ever see this?" She crossed the yard, wiping beeswax from her hands on her apron. Caleb pointed to the side of the tree opposite the horseshoe. A strip of bark had peeled loose in the storm, exposing a darker seam beneath. Within that seam, nearly hidden by the tree's growth, was a small brass plate set into the wood. Tarnish had made it almost the colour of bark. At its centre was a keyhole no wider than a thumbnail. Maeve went inside and brought the brass key from the mantel. It fit. The plate did not open easily. The tree had grown around it, and the little door, if door it was, had been closed through storms, drought, insects, and decades of weather. Caleb held the loose bark aside while Maeve turned the key with both hands. The lock resisted, then released with a small internal sound unlike any she had heard from the house. Behind the brass plate was a hollow lined with tin. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth and a note sealed with wax that had cracked but not fallen away. Maeve carried both inside before opening them. The flag unfolded slowly on the work table. 48 stars. Cotton, small enough for a burial or memorial. Its red stripes darkened with age. The note was dated November 11th, 1919. The handwriting was Lydia Bell's, older and less steady than Eleanor's. To the child who finds what grief hid. This flag was given after Thomas Edwin Bell was named among the fallen of the Great War. His body rests in France, but his mother could not bear all tokens of him shut in drawers. Edwin placed this little chamber in the walnut after Mary recovered, saying a living tree was a better keeper than a cedar chest, because it would grow around what we could not hold, if the tree remains. Remember that joy and mourning have stood in the same yard. Remember that no family is made only of survival. We are also made of what we honour after the living have gone back indoors. Keep the flag from damp. Speak his name when you can. Lydia Bell, Armistice Day, 1919. Maeve read it aloud once. Thomas Edwin Bell. The name entered the workroom and stayed there. The Purple Heart had already been researched by then with help from Reverend Boyd, Mrs. Harrow, and a patient archivist at the County Historical Society. Thomas had served with the American Expeditionary Forces and died after wounds received during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. His name appeared on a memorial list, and though his burial remained overseas, there was a family marker in the old section of Cambridge Cemetery, weathered nearly smooth beneath a cedar tree. On November 11th, 2025, Maeve carried the medal there. Not alone. Doris came in a dark coat. Harlan came with his cap held in both hands. Caleb stood awkwardly beside the path, unsure what to do with his height. Reverend Boyd spoke only briefly because the dead, he said, had already endured enough speeches. Maeve placed a small wreath of bay, rosemary, and cedar near the family marker, then set the Purple Heart on a folded cloth while Reverend Boyd read Thomas's name. The cemetery was cold that morning. Leaves moved across the grass in dry little runs. Traffic sounded faintly beyond the stone wall. No bugle played. No official came. No photograph was taken. That suited Maeve. Honour did not require an audience. It required accuracy. Afterward, the medal returned to the apothecary, not hidden in the drawer but placed in a small frame beside the 48-star flag, with Thomas's name written below in Maeve's hand. The money changed less than most people would have expected. Maeve spent only 4 coins. The first, a common-date gold piece sold through a careful dealer in Cambridge, paid for basic materials, bottles, tins, muslin, thermometers, labels, a proper scale calibration, wick wax and a lockable storage cabinet that met modern sense if not modern beauty. The second paid Harlan's account in full. though he argued over the final number and crossed out 3 charges while pretending the ink had skipped. The third helped cover county inspection fees, electrical reconnection, and a licensed plumber's work on the well and sanitary system. The fourth she used after long hesitation to buy liability insurance, because care without prudence was only sentiment dressed in clean clothes. The rest of the coins remained in the tin, each in its paper sleeve, counted once a year and then returned to the hidden compartment. Maeve added her own note to the top for the next one, not because she planned to disappear, not because she expected another exile to arrive by bus and find the place empty, but because inheritance had taught her to think beyond the heat of her own need. Hunger had a loud voice, fear had a louder one. The tin box, sealed and returned to the walnut drawer, allowed neither to become the only counsellor in the room. The shop reopened so quietly that some people missed it for weeks. There was no ribbon, no advertisement, no announcement in the county paper. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for a lost barn cat and a flyer for small engine repair. Bell Donnelly, candles, deride herbs, salves for hands, Saturdays 10 to 2. No medical claims, Chirk Creek Road. Maeve had written the card herself. The words "no medical claims" were underlined because the past had not been restored in order to repeat its dangers. She made calendula hand salve for cracked skin, clearly labelled for external use. She made beeswax candles, lavender sachets, dried mint, chamomile bundles, and small jars of rosemary salt. Doris insisted would sell if Maeve stopped apologising for it. She refused requests she could not answer safely. She referred fevers, infections, chest pain, pregnancy concerns, and every serious symptom to doctors, urgent care, or the emergency room. Some people respected this. Some were disappointed. Maeve learned that saying no was part of the craft. By summer, the mailing list had 43 names, written by hand in the ledger Harlan had given her. Most were local. A few belonged to women from Easton or Salisbury who had heard from cousins. One belonged to Mrs. Harrow, who ordered 2 candles every month and paid by cheque in an envelope addressed with formal precision. Doris bought candles for the cafe tables when winter returned. Reverend Boyd bought rosemary bundles for the church kitchen. Caleb bought nothing, but his mother did, and Maeve always tucked 1 extra small candle into her bag without comment. The shop did not make Maeve prosperous. It made her accountable. That was better than prosperity had ever sounded from a distance. In late autumn, Caleb arrived with something hidden beneath a canvas tarp in the bed of his pickup. He had become quieter as he grew older. Or perhaps his silences had gained weight. His hands were larger now, rough from work. And he wore his grandfather's watch with the cracked face because, he said, it still kept close enough time. Maeve came out as he lowered the tailgate. I made something, he said. He said it with the defensive tone of a young man prepared to be told the thing he cared about had missed its mark. Together they lifted the tarp. The sign was hand-carved from cedar, long enough to span the old bracket above the front door. Caleb had copied the original lettering from the weathered sign, still stored inside, but he had not duplicated it exactly. The letters were deeper, simpler, made by a careful amateur who had spent many evenings learning not to hurry the knife. The words read, Bell Donnelly Daughters, Apothecary. Maeve stood in the yard without speaking. Caleb shifted his weight. I know there was not always daughters in the name, but there should have been. The plural entered her more deeply than she expected. Not daughter. Daughters, not one woman redeemed for the sake of a tidy ending, but a line widened to include the hands history had used and then failed to name fully. Bridget, Lydia, Alice, Eleanor, Mary, Ruthie Bell, Elaine too perhaps, though not in the way Maeve could yet hold without pain. And whoever might come later, blood or not, if she arrived with careful hands and a need for shelter. It is right, Maeve said. Caleb looked at the sign. Not at her. I can hang it Saturday. We can hang it Saturday, he nodded, accepting the correction. They hung it in a light rain, because weather rarely waited for ceremony. Harlan steadied the ladder and gave unnecessary advice. Doris stood below with a paper bag of biscuits. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat when the sign settled into place, then said nothing at all, which was sometimes his finest form of blessing. The old sign did not go into the trash. Maeve cleaned it, wrapped it, and stored it in the front room above the counter, where its faded letters could remain part of the room's long account. That winter, after closing on a Saturday, Maeve began writing her own letter. She did not know who would read it. That was the point. The fire was low, snow tapped lightly against the repaired windows. The blue bottles held the last of the afternoon. On the work table lay Eleanor's letter, Lydia's note, Ruthie Bell's cracked bottle, the brass scale, the herb knife, the tin-type photograph of Mary at 25, and Maeve's own ledger open to a clean page. She had bought good paper in Cambridge and saved it for this heavy cream stock. Not unlike Eleanor's, though. She had no wish to imitate what did not belong to her. She sharpened a pencil first and made notes, then uncapped a fountain pen Mrs. Harrow had given her after retiring from the clerk's office. The pen had belonged, she said, to a judge who wrote slowly and listened slowly, which were both rare habits worth preserving. Maeve wrote the first line and stopped. "My dear one, whoever you are." She sat with those words for a long time. Then she continued, not to make a legend of herself, but to leave accurate instructions. She wrote the year she had arrived. She wrote that she had been cold and poor and not especially brave, only out of acceptable options. She wrote which repairs had been made and by whose hands. Owen Pritchard, roof. Harlan Tull, supplies and scents. Doris Bellamy, food and candles owed. Caleb Marsh, wood and sign. Reverend Samuel Boyd, morning prayer. Evelyn Harrow, record keeper. She wrote that the coins were not a prize. She wrote that the old remedies were not to be romanticized beyond their use. She wrote that doctors were not enemies and that neither were grandmothers. She wrote that any future keeper must learn botany, safety, law, dosage, contraindications, sanitation, labelling, humility, and when to send someone elsewhere. She wrote Ruthie Bell's sentence carefully. Care is not fear. Care is how love gets a body. Then she added her own, do not mistake being chosen for being excused from work. Outside snow gathered on the cedar shingles and slid cleanly from the eaves. Inside the stove held steady. The house had weathered 2 more winters, not triumphantly. Houses did not triumph. They endured by repair, by attention, by money spent carefully, by neighbours arriving with tools and food, by someone waking in the night when the wind changed. Maeve folded the first pages but did not seal them. There would be more to add, addresses, records, the location of the brass plate in the walnut tree, the meaning of the granite slab in the cellar, still unopened, the names of plants that thrived in the east bed and those that failed, the fact that black cumin seeds from 1938 never sprouted, but that planting them had still mattered, the price of insurance, the year the well pump was replaced, the phone number of a good electrician in Cambridge, the warning that grief can make a person spend too quickly. She placed the unfinished letter in a new envelope and set it inside the tincture cabinet, not in the hidden compartment yet, but near it. A letter should grow with the life it is meant to leave behind. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. In the final week of that year, Mrs. Harrow visited the shop as a customer, not a clerk. She was older now, though still exact, with her white hair cut at the jaw and her glasses hanging from the same silver chain. She bought 2 candles, 1 jar of hand salve, and a packet of dried lavender she said was for a linen drawer that had outlived 3 houses. While Maeve wrapped the items in brown paper, Mrs. Harrow stood near the front window and looked at the counter, the shelves, the stove visible through the doorway, the repaired floor, the sign outside with the added words. You kept the $1, Maeve said. Mrs. Harrow turned. The consideration bill? Yes, ma'am. The retired clerk's mouth moved in the smallest possible smile. In my desk drawer, under the Maryland paperweight. You still have it. I said I kept it. Maeve tied the paper bundle with thread. It belongs to the county. Does it not? It belongs to the record, Mrs. Harrow took the bundle and tucked it into her bag. Some records need something heavier than paper. After she left, Maeve stood behind the counter and watched her walk carefully across the road toward the waiting car. The afternoon was cold and bright. The marsh beyond the house lay brown and silver under winter light. Caleb's sign moved slightly on its bracket, not swinging loose, only acknowledging wind. Bell Donnelly Daughters. Inside, the stove ticked. A candle cooled. The ledger waited open to the next blank line. In the back room, the tincture cabinet held its drawers in patient order. Beneath one drawer, the coins remained sealed. On the mantel, the brass key rested beside the framed medal and the folded flag. In the cellar, the granite slab with the carved craft mark stayed where it had been, not forgotten, only not yet called upon. Maeve turned the shop sign from open to closed and stood for a moment with her hand on the door. A person could spend years believing exile meant being cast out from the only places that could have claimed her, but sometimes exile carried a person beyond the reach of those who had mistaken possession for care. Sometimes it brought her cold and nearly empty-handed, to a road that had fallen off maps, a shop the county wanted gone, a drawer no one had opened, and a line of women who had left not comfort but instructions. The apothecary waits. It has always waited. And miles away in Cambridge, in the bottom drawer of a retired clerk's old desk, beneath a paperweight shaped like Maryland, a worn $1 bill still lay folded in the dark, holding its place in the record of how a condemned building changed hands, and how a woman with nowhere to go became careful enough to stay.